Good afternoon. It is noon and time for us to start. Welcome to the Education Funding Task Force and to everyone who came in out of the beautiful weather to be in here today. Thank you. Appreciate it. We do have several people who are filling in today, and I'd just like to welcome them. We have Representative Sherry Brantley, who is here for now Senator Scott Hill. And I would like to take the time to thank Scott Hill for his work on this task force. This task force loss is the Senate's gain, and I look forward to working with Senator Hill in the Senate. We also have Dr. Brad Kemp. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Dr. Kemp, sitting in for Dr. Ninswander, who is at his son's wedding. So congratulations and welcome to committee. And then we also have Kathy Hopkins, who is the chair of the State Board of Education, filling in for Jim Porter today. So welcome to all of you. Please feel free to jump in, ask questions, and participate. That would be much valued. So just to kind of catch everyone up, especially those who are subbing in, what we have been doing, we started our work on this task force earlier this year in the legislative session. We started with doing some informational hearings on our current funding formula, what other states are doing to fund their schools. And since session has been out, we've been doing a deeper dive into each of the weightings. And so far, we've done our low and high enrollment weighting, transportation, and bilingual. And so this month, we're looking at our at-risk weighting. And so hopefully that'll give you just a little bit lay of the land. So as we go through this is very much question interactive because we will be looking at different possibilities of how we can maybe restructure our weighting. And so please feel free to ask questions, provide your opinion or input as we go through today. With that, we will start with a little bit of follow-up from our low and high enrollment weighting from last month's discussion, and I believe Matthew is going to lead that.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Task Force members. My name is Matthew Willis, Principal Research Analyst at Legislative Research. So this follow-up is to kind of go over a couple high-low enrollment models from that the task force had talked about last month. And so one thing I will note, so these should be behind the blue sheet in your very large folder that says high-low enrollment or something to that degree. One thing I want to point out is Jennifer and I, in order to try and make them easier to refer to, you will notice in the upper right-hand corner for model that each one of them now is going to start having kind of a unique number. So for instance, the top one is 1.0, the one below it 1.01, 1.02, etc. So that way, when we're talking about them or you're asking questions, rather than trying to parse together what can be similar titles, you can just refer to that number and hopefully it's a little easier to track. So the first one that I'm going to start with is Model 1.0, the no high enrollment and reduced low enrollment weighting in base. So this was where the task force had asked about seeing what it would be like to removing high enrollment and then reducing low enrollment by a comparable amount and then putting that difference between current funding and what those reductions would be into an enhanced base number for base state aid. So what you will see looking at the top row, that's the blue for state totals, the state foundation aid difference from current is about just over $6,000 due to some rounding. And so while the low-high enrollment weighting would be reduced by almost $62 million. The enhanced base does essentially make state foundation aid stay the same. And then in almost any model where we are increasing base aid above what that local option budget base currently is, you will see a reduction in local option budget of around $16 million. And that is just due to kind of the math of decreasing overall FTEs and having a higher base, but a base that is not quite as high. Yeah, it's just the math with the fact that the LOB base is higher than what we think of as base for state foundation aid. And again, like with most of these documents, the first few pages will have it in order of USD number, and then once you get through that first half, it will then switch to one that is organized from lowest to highest. So you will see that there are some districts that even with the enhanced base, you will see that 259 Wichita, 233 Olathe, 512 Shawnee Mission, there are some districts that would still see an overall reduction of over $1 million, and then a variety of other districts that will both lose and gain, with, yes, the largest loss being Wichita with a total of 3.5, including local option budget, and the largest gain being 214 Ulysses with a total gain of $256,000. So with that, I'm happy to stand for any questions on this first one before I go into the density.
Are there any questions? Representative Williams?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay, so we're going over this kind of quickly, and so I just want you to walk us through the numbers that you have on the top. For example, the column F, model total weighted FTE, including special education. It goes down. Tell me again why just taking out the high enrollment takes away the FTE number.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Representative, thank you for that question. So the reason that the FTE is dropping in some districts that are not seeing any change in the weighting is because when we go to increase base, we go back and have to refigure special education, cost of living, ancillary, those three weightings because they are backed into. And so when you were taking their largely it's special education funding and dividing it by a larger base, you were getting a smaller FTE because for LOB purposes, we still do have FTEs of items that are appropriated kind of flat amounts or not necessarily kind of a formulaic. And so anytime that we do an enhanced base, you will see a change in the total weighted FTE because we have to recalculate those backed into numbers.
Okay, thank you.
So along those lines, Matthew, is there a way to minimize that reduction in FTE? Is there a way to not back in if we change the way we do the ancillary? I know that's kind of a very vague question, but to avoid that?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I mean, it would largely be that. It would be if the task force decided a different model that proactively kind of created a weighting, or just reorganized things so that you did not need to back in and creating that. I mean, I guess one example would be for cost of living or ancillaries. Instead of creating an FTE weighting, it could just be for local option budget calculations that they just add what that amount would be, could potentially be an option, and then you don't have to create. It's just kind of all about whether or not you need that FTE created in order to help determine what the local option budget is.
Okay. Senator Petty.
Matthew, so you said that would I be right, the first page is 1, 2, 3, so through 6, that's in numbered order for the school districts. And then in the next section, 1 through 6, this is it with those with the greatest loss?
Madam Chair, Senator, yes. So the second 1 through 6 is organized so that the district, it's all off of that column T for the total difference of state foundation aid and computed local option budget. The district that would see in this model the largest decrease in funding would be ranked at the top, and the district that would gain the largest amount of total funding between foundation aid and local option budget would be last. Again, just to kind of help see another way of being able to look and see who are the ones that are potentially being losing or gaining the most funding.
Did you by chance at any time take what percentage of our students statewide would be losing?
Madam Chair, Senator, I have not. We could absolutely kind of figure that out and either work it into future tables or just provide that information.
Yeah, I think that'd be helpful because, I mean, I'm just going to make an assumption here. A largest, probably 3/4 of our students statewide would be losing, if not more. So I'd like to know that number.
Are you? Yes. Representative Williams?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would just note, just to save us all time, that none of these changes are in a vacuum. One doesn't just change and then we ignore it and we move on. So we can get those numbers all day long, but the reality is that we're not going to cut $16 million. So what we're trying to do is make it more equitable because it wasn't. I mean, there are so many things that were problematic. So it's not that 1/3, 2/3, 3, whatever it is, are going to lose funding. It's that we're trying to move the money in a way that best provides for real students in real seats and not be just arbitrary, which is high enrollment, low enrollment is arbitrary.
Dr. Harwood?
I was just going back to what you're talking about with not backing into FTE. I talked about that last time about transportation, special education, we do the same with. And so it does complicate the formula as opposed to just, if you calculate an amount of money, I don't know that you gain anything by dividing by the base just so you can add that to the FTE to multiply back by the base. So I think we can do some things in that regard to simplify things, and then that would change it. It's the same amount of money that's happening there, but it could impact the LOB differently, which is in all these models that we add the money back in, we're finding about a $16 million decrease in statewide LOB, and that could be due to just that we are lowering the FTE. So it's one of the things to look at going forward.
Any other questions before we move on? Seeing none, please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the next three that are all in here are all kind of delineations of the same model, which is the task force had asked about trying to see what it might be like to move to more of a density type model for kind of low or high enrollment rather than a student kind of census or a student FTE one. And so you will also see it should have been probably on top of your folder because I got it created late. This white sheet that says supporting information for the density weighting models. This was my attempt to kind of help provide some supporting information to better explain how I got to this. So I looked at a few other state models, and rather than trying to fit Kansas into a model for another state for density, I just looked to other kind of formulas within Kansas funding statutes for education and kind of Frankensteined a few together to create this. So the main components that this goes off of is using for the base of the density range and figures from the transportation funding formula. And then utilizing kind of the factor weighting element from capital outlay state aid. And so to kind of walk through the process is, so with transportation, as you remember, you take the number of students transported and divide it by the square miles of the district. So here I just took the total adjusted enrollment of a district and divided it by the square miles of the district to determine the density of the district. I then put it through the transportation and had to extend it in an instance that I'll get to later, but put it onto the transportation density range, and then looked at it and thought, rather than trying to come up with numbers, since as we know transportation kind of has those just those funding numbers that are not necessarily tied to base or anything like that, I used the capital outlay state aid formula, which is for the capital outlay state aid, you would take the median district's assessed valuation per pupil, or in this case, I took the median density of the districts, and that is 25%. And then for the median, which is the first one we'll talk about, for each density range below the median, that's the 25%, it would grow by 2%. And then for each range, each step of range above, it would decrease by 2%. So on that supporting information, you'll see the median density of a district is just over 2 students per square mile, 2 FTE per square mile. So that range of 2.04 to 2.319 would get 25%. And then as the density decreases, you increase in the percentage, and as the density gets above that, it decreases. And then I take that percentage, multiply the school district's total adjusted enrollment by whatever that percentage is, and that is the weighted FTE. And so as you will see here for the median, this is just capturing what that would be. So overall, it would be a decrease by just taking the median and utilizing this factor without any further adjustments, without moving the money anywhere, anything like that. To finish up on my supporting information, any of the school districts, you will see I did, for your edification, go ahead and call out the districts that are currently receiving low enrollment that would not be receiving an additional weighting under this density model, similarly with high enrollment. So any districts that are in orange are going to be ones that, if they are currently receiving low enrollment, would not be receiving it under the median one. Any of the ones under the high enrollment that are in orange would be ones that are receiving it under the median. So you see there's some overlap because, again, it deals with the density in the area based on the students. And so, for instance, even though, to go to the low enrollment, even though 499 Galena has 765 students, their district is 13 and a half square miles, and so they have a high density that puts them outside of the range. I'm happy to stop for questions here before I dive into the permutations of the model. I figure this is a lot as I tried to kind of put something together.
Thank you. And for the folks who are subbing in, I forgot to announce that there will be a quiz as your exit ticket on this very model. So just want to make you aware of that. Questions for Matthew on this? Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Matthew, for all this work. I will admit that I am still trying to wrap my head around how we do transportation to begin with. What I would really benefit from as I sit down and look at this later in the week is a paragraph or two of what you just said, maybe with some nuance stapled to this piece of paper. Because, you know, try as I might, I'm not as smart as you are today, so that narrative when we get charts like this would really be helpful to me.
Director Ricker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I too am processing what was just unpacked here. As I don't even know how to frame a question at the moment. I think, so if I look at the table on the supporting document, we're talking about the density of students within the square miles of the district. Is there any connection to the population density in a county or a region or any other connection other than the district footprint and the number of students?
Madam Chair, Director Rooker, I did not look into any connections between the two. I was simply looking at, just trying to capture information and a method that we already have. And so this is looking at, the student population with the assumption that by and large, most of those students would be living within the district. And so I did not look about non-student population densities that would be there, but I would presume that most students enrolled in a district are likely living within the district, and so would be captured within that.
I do wonder, though, when you think about a county classified as frontier rural, if you have a school district, it seems logical that it might be concentrated in a smaller square mile footprint because it's sort of the center of where the population resides. But then you have this big geographic region that puts the people in a remote setting. I would think that would have some effect on costs and have some bearing on what we're trying to achieve by putting a weighting in place to deal with population density. So I just raise that as a question, because the transportation within that compact area, that's one thing that, you don't have to drive miles and miles and miles if it's a smaller footprint for the district catchment area. But if that district is located in isolation, you will see other higher costs for certain items, which this weighting is sort of intended to, is intended to address. So I would have some concerns about not looking at other factors that weigh in to the question of population density.
Senator Petty.
So Matthew, I mean, I totally agree. I'm lost in this formula that you use. But looking at the one-sheeter that you provided, so I see the 25% under factor for median, and then in the 25% for factor for mean. So if I look at the larger bundle of of school districts, how is that then reflected there?
So, Madam Chair, Senator, so one of the models further down in the packet is one that does it based off of the mean density, which is why it's there. And I'm happy to go over kind of the remaining two models that are derivations of this, or derivatives of this. I just was kind of pausing here to try and help address some questions before diving in. But yeah, there is some differences based on mean, because if you're looking at essentially the average density, that does climb up. And so kind of adjusts, as you'll see when we get to the model, it does adjust things differently.
Okay, I'll wait for that. Thanks.
Seeing no other questions, Matthew, please go to the models.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. So the second model that you'll see is still working off of median, but this is where instead of just having that negative $131 million, $131.5 million, I went ahead and took that difference and put it back into raising the base, like we have with a lot of the other models. And so you can just see there as far as the differences of essentially doing a mean level density model, taking it for what it is for the sake of this model, and then taking the difference and putting it into base. You'll see then that state foundation aid maintains the same across for a state total of $4.2 billion. And then you would see where the districts are going to, again, kind of gain or lose funding, some based off of those changes in FTE. And then the third one, just to kind of highlight, would be this one is going off of the mean. So it is the same process. It's just instead of using the median density district of just over 2, I use the average density district that is just over 19 students per square mile. And so from there, because it was a larger curve, and so just to kind of not very quickly hit 0 or 100% and kind of max or min out at either of those, this one is adjusted by 1.5%. per kind of step away from that 25. And so largely what you'll just see is more districts that are getting something. And so when looking at the mean, the only district currently receiving low enrollment that would not receive some weighting factor under a mean density model is Fort Leavenworth. All of the others, so the ones that are in orange on the low enrollment districts would receive one under the mean model. And then it's inversed, so that in the high enrollment districts, any districts that are in green would receive a density weighting under the mean model, but do not receive it under the median. Because again, it's just you're kind of stretching out kind of that curve, and you're stretching out the densities because you're starting at both that higher density with the average and kind of each step is growing or shrinking a little bit slower than it was in the median model. Other than that, it's the same thought process of the number of adjusted FTE per square mile and utilizing that same kind of stepped kind of curve. And so with this one, you would actually see a state foundation aid increase of $126.4 million because by and large, while you have some districts losing weightings and losing state foundation aid, you also have a lot of others that are gaining. And so between the local option budget and the state foundation aid, the mean model would show basically $168 million increase of funding both from the state and the local option budget. And so with that, I'm happy to take questions on any of these, and again, try and work through this pretty complicated thought process.
What questions for Matthew? What I will offer, because I don't know about the rest of the members, I'm trying to process as I'm listening, and so I will reserve the option to come back to this tomorrow after maybe we've had a little bit more time to look through the models and digest it, if that would be helpful. We'll be sure and circle back and give that opportunity as you think through some of this information that's been presented. But are there any immediate questions that we can answer at this time? Yes, Representative McDonald.
Could we get that paragraph before we go home today? It would really help me. Thank you.
I will do my best.
Okay, so we will circle back tomorrow during a discussion time and open it back up for this if need be, okay?
Perfect.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Is there anything else you need to share with us?
The last thing I just wanted to mention, we had also, my colleague Elena, had put together a small size, isolated, or sparsity funding in other states memo. Again, just to provide other thought processes, because again, we are happy to look at anything. It all just kind of depends on the data available and ideas on how to get to that. So just an additional resource. With that, I am done.
Director Rooker, just a moment, Matthew. Director Rooker.
Thank you. This is where I started to really dig in, so maybe why I was missing a little bit of the explanation. I think where I become curious is whether we can take a look at some of these models to see if there is a version that feels logical for Kansas and see how it would apply in our universe of school districts and the approach to funding. These feel very abstract. I know there's a lot of work that lives behind creating them, but I think I'm intrigued at how the question of density or sparsity or any of those things might be a factor that somebody has developed a model that might make sense. So I would feel better knowing that is an option, and maybe, Madam Chair, that's a question for you, whether, before we hone in on this is going to be the committee's approach, whether we might have some discussion about whether there's a version that we're intrigued by.
Yeah, appreciate that. So one of the things we can do now, the format for our meetings going forward, next month, we're looking at special education. September is technically the last days we have permission from LCC to meet. So I have kind of reserved September for just that, to kind of wrap up what we have been looking at. And so what I would say is if there are specific state models that seem to kind of mirror our demographics or make sense, that we can have staff go, okay, what would happen if we used the, Texas model or whatever? Can you run that versus what we currently have? Or any suggestions like that? I think September is going to be a time when we kind of really look at what are our options, what would that look like for Kansas, and since we don't know if we'll have time after that is my intent. So, Director Rooker.
Just to follow on with that and to wrap in Representative Williams' point, at that point, we should be looking at how options work in concert with each other.
Exactly. Because if you take one of these weightings, as we've talked about in isolation, the impact, if you just use that as a standalone, it can be either exciting or alarming. And so it's a domino effect. So how would all of these rolled in affect every part of the formula? So I'm hoping we get to that point in September where we can really, at least have a preliminary look at what the work we've done now and put it together is the goal. So if that makes sense to everyone, hopefully. Any other questions, comments? If not, thank you, Matthew, appreciate it. Last time, we heard from Dr. Harwood that he was going to go on a tour around the state and have conversations with stakeholders, and that is an important consideration of this task force. And so we wanted to set aside some time for him to share any insights or opinions or comments from those conversations. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Harwood.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the task force. So as I said last month, we had our budget workshops in June. So we went to 7 different sites, basically all over the state. We went to Valley Center, Greenbush, which is in Girard. Then we went to Hutchinson, Sublette, Oakley, Abilene, and Topeka. I think that was 7 of them. And we saw about 700 school staff during that time. It's mostly board clerks, business managers, and superintendents. Because we had 700, there were several districts bring more than one, and we let anybody who comes fill out the survey. So that's why we have 407 responses. So the first page is pretty simple. We just wanted to get a little bit about the district, and as expected, the majority of responses were from districts that are 200 to 500, because that's what we have the most of. And that just kind of goes down from there. On the next one, again, not surprising that the majority of our responses were from rural districts. What we did is started looking at some of the responses broken down by rural, urban, suburban, and then a little bit by population. We haven't had a lot of time to work on that because we just got done on Wednesday of last week. But I'll just kind of go through these and I give you a little bit of information on that. So number 3, I think the context of the way we asked this question is important. We had talked about just kind of giving an update on what the task force had been doing. And so what we had talked about is which of the weightings is the most important. And we'd already talked about that the task force has said that there's not an intention to save money. And so some of that would be which should be a weighting versus what might be able to be not a weighting if the money is still there. So that's a little bit of that. I don't think anybody would say, please take money away. Certainly not with the group we were talking to. And so it's important that they saw that. So you can see that at risk was by far the one that was chosen most often, and they could only choose one. Of those of the at risk, it was much more important for suburban and urban districts, and as you might expect, low enrollment was much more important for rural districts and low enrollment districts. It makes kind of sense. The other 3 were just varied. I will tell you that bilingual was, got the most results at Sublette, which is in southwest Kansas, because we have more bilingual students in southwest Kansas. So they see it as a higher need than some other districts do. So I just gives you a little bit. They only got to choose one and looked at all of those that way. And I'm happy to take questions on each of these, Madam Chair, or I can go through and take questions at the end.
I see hands popping up, so if you would, Director Rooker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Harwood, on the question 7, the final option was other, please specify. Did you guys get other options for that we might be interested in hearing?
So I was going to get to that when I talked about number 7. But yeah, so
Okay,
we did.
okay,
I will say that even question number 5, which you don't have, was open-ended. We have not had time to go back and look at those. We will do that.
Okay, thank you.
So question 4, this was, again, the urban and actually suburban districts were more likely to say high base, low weightings than the rural and urban districts were more likely to say low base and high weightings. And that makes sense because they get more, I mean, in general, they get more weighting, so that makes sense for that. But just a little breakdown on that. But the majority was more comfortable with a lower base and higher weightings, which is, and I think we talked about this early on, comparatively, Kansas has a lower base and higher weightings versus other states that tend to have a higher base and lower weightings. And you could still spend the same amount of money, it's just that how it gets distributed depends on that. The next one, number 6, is about special education. This one, I will say that rural districts were more, not more likely, but of the answers about no, there were more rural districts that had concerns. Some of that specifically has to do with the amount of travel time special educators have to have moving between places. So they're actually paying for more windshield time than urban or suburban people are, even if they are multiple buildings. And that adds to expenses that would not be connected to having that student. So that's a concern that they have. But I think the majority are certainly willing to look at another model. One of the things I told them was an advantage to that is that you find out what your funding is before the 12th month of the budget, which I think a lot of them thought was a good idea. All right, and then number 7. So this question was the only one where they could pick multiples, and so that's why there are more than the 407 answers. And so again, the highest amount was graduation rates, pretty well spread out with the state assessments. For the other, yes, we did get a list of them. In a quick look, a lot of those were concerns about this as a funding weighting. But we'll get to all those numbers when we have a chance to sit down and look at all of the responses. Transportation was one that was a little bit surprising in that the highest number of responses, not the majority, were that 2.5 miles is fine. The next most is a mile. Then kind of the other ones just have some spread around there. And we were expecting a higher number to say they wanted something less than 2.5 miles. But the next question actually helps with the helps with that a little bit, in that the majority of districts are saying no, we don't need an allowance for dangerous situations. However, rural districts, 63% no and 37% said yes. Urban districts, 69% said yes and 31% no. And then suburban was 44% said yes and 56% no. So that actually kind of makes some sense that rural districts don't have as many of the danger areas where the urban districts have much more problems going a very short distance for students. So makes a little sense when you look at it that way. The other questions, question 5, which wasn't on there, was if you could add a weighting, what would it be? Again, that was an open-ended one. We'll get those grouped together and get those out to committee when we have, before the, I guess, August meeting. This is a July meeting, even though it's July 1. So we'll get those out there. Before we go, there are any questions? And I have just a little statement about how I've wrapped up that conversation with the districts.
Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was shuffling my papers when you said this at the beginning. Can you tell me again, like, from the people who answered the survey, how representative are urban and suburban districts compared to, I'm sure there was a large number of rural participants in your survey?
So yes, if you look at question 2, see 85% identified their district as rural.
Okay,
I
thank
mean,
you
so
so much.
that's why I want to look at, even like with the question about, do we need an exception for dangerous crossing dangerous situations? That looks overwhelmingly as no, or at least a majority of no, unless you start looking at, well, most of those were rural, and rural districts answered that the most. So, I mean, you just kind of have to take that into consideration when you look at the totals.
Okay, if I could follow up, if you don't mind. To Senator Petty's point earlier, sometimes, like in this chart, an urban district, for instance, would represent, those 2 or 3 people that came to your thing would represent a large number of children compared to maybe one of the rural or people representing many fewer students. So I'd like to take this with a grain of salt, but it is interesting to see, and I'll look forward to those weighting ideas. Thank you.
We will, our intention is we're going to we think there are a lot of things that were similar things. We'll group them together and kind of come up with what those groups were. So then, okay, go ahead. I just have one more thing before I'm done.
Okay, Representative Estes has a question.
I notice you have 407 people who responded. That's greater than our number of school districts.
Right.
How many school districts participated in this survey?
I don't know that off the top of my head. We'd have to go back to see. Not all of the 285 districts actually come to budget workshops. It's usually less than 10 that don't. So I would say about 270 or so.
And so you get your 407 by, like, some districts brought more than one person with them, but you don't know this information on a district-by-district basis, do you?
We were trying to keep it anonymous, so we didn't have them identify their district. There were a little over 700 attendees at all 7 sessions, and we got 407 responses from those 700 people.
Okay, so one district's answer may be there 2 or 3 times, and another district's may not, so that makes the math a little challenging.
Yeah, it does.
Okay, but it's interesting nonetheless. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, I would say that the proportions of rural, urban, and suburban districts is relatively correct, I think, when you look at that. But you're right, we don't know how many of the answers were there.
Real quick, are you moving on to the at-risk document? Or are we still talking about the survey?
That risk is tomorrow.
Okay. Okay, so I do have a couple of questions on this. And by the way, this is very interesting. On question 3, when it says, what student weighting has the biggest impact on your school district? What was the definition of biggest impact?
We kind of let them do that. What we talked about is of a weighting that you would like to keep as a weighting versus maybe having it be the weighting going away and going into just an increase in the base. It was the kind of the impetus for the question.
Biggest impact financially, not necessarily what has the biggest impact on your student outcomes.
And I would
Okay.
assume that when it was clerks and business managers, they're going to look at it financially. You might add some superintendents or others there that start looking at another portion of it. But with this group, I would say financially was there because we were at a budget workshop, kind of predisposed for that.
And on question 7, again, I believe you said that people could choose multiple answers on that, correct? So if I'm looking at state assessment scores, ACT, and other nationally normed tests, if you add those together, kind of that theme of having some type of objective assessment of student outcome, it's larger, but that there could be duplicate responses from the same individual.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Other questions?
And that was the only one where you could pick multiple responses.
Okay, Director Rooker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To sort of piggyback, I think, Dr. Harwood, I would be curious if the nature of the staff responsibilities of those gathered could conceivably have an impact on perspective where, like, take the very surprising results for the transportation question. Is that a comfort level that we know how this version works, so it's easy, and or if we're talking about how something translates to having impact, like I think there's work to, this is interesting as a starting point, but I would hope we would hone in on more input from subject matter areas that might have a more informed.
And I would say that if the task force thinks this information is useful, we can do other surveys and target just, we could send it just to curriculum directors, or we could send it just to transportation directors. So we have listservs for all those groups that if there's specific information we would like for specific experts in the districts to look at, we can do that. This seemed to be the best way with the group that we had in front of us at that time.
Absolutely, yeah, no, but I would think that, the metrics that we should look at for student outcomes is not going to be in the wheelhouse of a budget director.
That's true. And even to the chair's part about the different types of metrics for the outcomes-based, that would be a better question for the curriculum directors or school improvement folks. And so if we get farther along and say, how do we feel about this list of things? We can do those surveys. Those will be easier to do in August. Well, those will be easier for people to get the emails in August. August is not a great time to be sending emails to school folks because that probably is not the top of their list. So, but we can do some of those as we move forward.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And if you do go back out and ask more questions, I would love a follow-up on the graduation rates, because that's highly subjective and the schools would control that figure in terms of outcomes. And I noticed that there's at least 6 states that have exit exams. Now, if the graduation rate was tied to an exit exam where they had to achieve a certain level, that would make it not subjective. And so perhaps add with an exit exam on there and get a feel of how they would respond to that to get a better indicator of have student outcomes improved.
My first thought is I don't believe that the people that were doing this would think that graduation rates are subjective. No.
Senator Petty.
So just along that point, so maybe it might be helpful if we have a list of what is required to graduate in Kansas.
So there's, we can give you the state requirements. Each local district can require more, but we can get you the state requirements.
They can require more, but not less.
Not less, right?
Thank you.
Anything else before we move on? Okay, Dr. Harwood.
So just to follow up, a little bit of our conversation last week, I did talk to to everybody in the room, all 7 rooms, about what they should be thinking about the task force work. And the first thing I said is there's going to be a lot of models, and some of them will make you cringe, but you should not panic, and that don't go to your legislature and say, why are you getting rid of low enrollment? Because nobody's done anything yet. I said, however, if over the summer you see your legislator, you can say, hey, do you know why this particular weighting is so important to our district and to our community? I said, you can, educating and talking to your legislators is great idea, but it's not about why are you doing this, because nothing yet has happened. We are exploring options, and I expressed, that they should go look at these options or at the models that are being produced so that they have a better understanding of how each of the weightings ties together. So just want to make sure that I get out there that that's the message that I gave, is that you can certainly engage with your legislators about why any particular part of the funding formula is important to your community, but there is no panic at this point. There's no reason to be upset about things. It's just getting more informed. So.
Thank you. Thank you for that message. I think that probably lowers the blood pressure of a lot of our school people to know that that's where we are in the process, is just throwing out, models and ideas to look at as potential solutions. So thank you for conveying that message. Thank you for bringing this back. It was very interesting. Appreciate it. Okay. So that leads us to then switching gears and starting our overview on at-risk weighting. And we will start that with, and we are ahead of schedule, so don't look at the clock. We're not going to jinx it. We'll start with Tamara Lawrence from the Revisor's Office.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, committee. I'm going to talk about a few components of at-risk, including the at-risk student weighting that essentially generates the money, the at-risk education fund for the expenditure of money, and then the criteria to determine the students who are eligible to receive at-risk services. You should have access to 2 revisor memoranda. The first one I'm going to speak to says at-risk weighting in big letters at the top. So the at-risk student weighting itself is fairly straightforward and can be found at KSA 725151A. Don't read beyond A, that's other stuff, but A is the at-risk student weighting itself. The weighting is determined by multiplying the number of students in a school district who qualify as at risk for purposes of the school finance formula by the weighting factor of 0.484. So there are 2 elements to this, the qualifying students and the weighting factor. So I'm going to talk about the students first. For purposes of the school finance formula, qualifying students are those students who are eligible for free meals under the National School Lunch Act. And except for students with IEPs, those students attend school full-time and are 19 years of age or younger. So students who meet that criteria serve as the proxy in the formula to generate the at-risk funding money. But I just want to note that qualifying for free meals does not impact whether or not a student receives at-risk services. And we will talk about students who receive those services later, but I just want to point out there's a difference when we're talking about at-risk students for purposes of funding and at-risk students who receive services. So now I'm going to talk about the weighting factor. It currently is 0.484, as I mentioned, and it has been set at this number since 2017, when the School Equity and Enhancement Act was first enacted. If you look at page 2 of the memo, there is a chart that lists every iteration of the at-risk student weighting factor that has gone into effect since 1992, when the weighting first came about as part of the SDF QPA. So that is my explanation of the weighting. If you have any questions, I will be happy to answer questions on that part.
Questions? So I do have a quick question. I think I know, but want to just make sure everyone understands. Where did the 0.484, where did the weightings come from? I mean, in 92 it's 0.05. So what were those weightings based on?
So the one I can speak to for sure is the 0.484. That one, I believe, originally came about in a 2006 Division of Legislative Post-Audit cost study analysis. And that came about in 2017. I believe at the time, the legislature was asked by the court to look at a couple of things that led them there. One is they had to, quote unquote, show their work, and the cost study analysis was a way to do that. And the second one is the court did ask them to look at subgroups of students, including at-risk students. So in Those who were there in 2017, feel free to correct me or add to that, but that is what I remember being the factors that led to the .484.
And before 1992, there was no such thing as at-risk weighting, correct?
I believe you are correct.
And I apologize for not asking for this sooner. It would be interesting to know, another column on this chart would be the amount spent during those timeframes each year with the .05 in 1992, if that would be possible to get. Yes, Jason Long from Revisor's Office.
Yes, Madam Chair. Just note, on several of these charts, we can see historical weightings. You'll see an annual increase from 2005 to 2008 on there. Those were the post-Montoy increases in school funding after the Montoy 3 decision from the Kansas Supreme Court, in which the legislature implemented a 3-year plan to increase funding, and that part of that plan was often to increase various weightings each year to build in additional funding.
Thank you for that context. Any other questions on this portion? Seeing none, please continue.
All right, so we're going to switch memos. The second memo you should have says At-Risk Education Fund at the top. So every school district has an at-risk education fund, and KSA 725153 provides the requirements for that fund. School districts are required to deposit money generated by the district's at-risk and high-density at-risk student weightings into its at-risk education fund. Additionally, districts must also transfer the amount of LOB money that is otherwise attributable to the at-risk student weighting to this fund. So that's primarily how state law directs money into this fund, is the weighting and the LOB portion that's attributable to the weighting. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the expenditures from the fund. So the purpose of the fund is to provide students identified as academically at risk with additional educational opportunities, interventions, and evidence-based instructional services above and beyond regular educational services. Expenses of a school district that are directly attributable to providing at-risk student assistance or programs are required to be paid from the at-risk education fund, and expenditures from the fund can only be made for at-risk and provisional at-risk educational programs that are above and beyond regular educational services to students who are academically at risk, the personnel providing those educational services, at-risk services training support for instructional classroom personnel, and contracted at-risk and provisional at-risk educational services. School districts may only expend monies on at-risk programs that have been approved by the state board. Approved programs must provide best practices and evidence-based instruction to academically at-risk students who are eligible to receive at-risk programs and services above and beyond that of regular education. And the state board must publish its list of approved programs on its website. The state board may also authorize provisional at-risk programs. School districts may not expend monies from the district's at-risk education fund for any program or service that is not state board approved or an authorized provisional at-risk program. So that is a quick rundown of this fund and its requirements, and I will be happy to answer questions on that piece.
What questions do we have? Director Ricker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you. Quick look at the statute included in the funding memo. I'm trying to catch up on recent legislative actions because I know we're looking at some prior LPA audits. There was a point at which evidence-based as acceptable materials involved a 5-year peer-reviewed research model. Was that removed from statute, or does that still impact choices?
Yeah, that particular 5-year piece was removed from statute, and you are absolutely correct. This statute was substantively amended, I believe, in both 2019 and 2021. So if you would like to see those changes, I can get those for the committee.
Any other questions at this point? Seeing none, please continue. Sorry, Dr. Harwood.
It was also significantly amended in 2024 as part of Senate Bill, or House of SB 387. So it's had some recent significant changes.
Thank you.
Okay, please proceed.
Okay, so the next thing I want to mention is identifying students who are academically at risk. These are not necessarily the students who qualify for free lunch. But KSA 725153A establishes the criteria for school districts to identify academically at-risk students who are eligible to receive at-risk programs and services. You can see this list in its entirety on page 3 of the memo or in the statute. I won't go through each one for you, but it does include factors such as student attendance, academic performance, and certain social emotional needs. So these are the students that money in the at-risk fund should be expended for. And then the only thing that I will note lastly is on pages 4 and 5 of the fund memo is a quick summary of the at-risk student accountability program. And I only mention this because there is currently an ongoing at-risk student accountability pilot that I believe you're going to hear about tomorrow. So I did want to point out, here's some background information on the statute for that. And then there's also a separate memo. So I wanted to point that out, and I will be happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Task Force, what questions do we have for Tamara at this point? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much. Okay, next we have had a couple of legislative post audits on at-risk funding, and we have Heidi Zimmerman here from Legislative Post Audit to go over those with us, and we have built in quite a bit of question and answer time, so appreciate you being here today. Heidi, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am Heidi Zimmerman. I'm a principal auditor at Legislative Post Audit, and I am here to present 2 audits on at-risk, and these are the 2 most recent audits we have conducted on risk. They were released in 2019 and 2023. If it is okay with the chair, we might hold off on questions till we're through both audits, because I think some questions will be answered in the 2023 audit that may have stemmed from the 2019 audit.
That's fine.
A few things I want to comment on just before I really get started on the audits. First of all, as we kind of already heard, the laws have changed a couple of times since 2019. So in 2019 and 2023, we were evaluating compliance with the laws that were in place at those specific times. And so those exact laws may no longer apply. And then second, the exact list of the KSDE programs and practices, the list that I refer to in both audits, also no longer really exists. So KSDE has changed those lists over time, and as the laws regarding what can be on those lists have changed. So any problems that we call out that are specific, they are specific to the list in place at that time.
I'm so sorry, if I may just interject. We do have hard copies of those audits in your packet, so if you want to have those for reference, just want to make sure everyone knew. Thank you.
So anyway, the list, the problems that we might mention, they are specific to the list at that time, and they may or may not apply to any other lists in any other years. So the first audit I'm going to start with is the 2019 audit. And it has 3 questions, and those questions are listed on page 1. But the first work that we did for this audit was to compare at-risk spending to at-risk funding. So we chose 20 out of the state's then 286 school districts to review. We chose these districts for variety in location and size and the percentage of the students who were eligible for free lunch. This sample is not projectable, though, because we did not randomly select the districts. And we compared the districts' at-risk funding to the amount they reported spending on at-risk services. So first of all, I should note that the way the at-risk funding is calculated is consistent across all the school districts, but what districts consider to be at-risk spending sometimes varies. So for example, one district might consider federal Title I spending to be at-risk spending, and another might not. But the results of the comparison are on page 4. So based on the 20 districts, they reported spending nearly $162 million on at-risk services in the 2019 school year, compared to the nearly $125 million they received in at-risk funding. So as you can see, though, there's a lot of variation. So you have Blue Valley at the very top of that list, and where only about 40% of their at-risk spending was covered by at-risk funding, all the way down to the bottom where you see Wellington, who actually received slightly more funding than they spent. Overall, the at-risk funding covered about 77% of spending, but again, lots of variation across those 20 school districts. We also looked at how many students received services and how they compared to the number of at-risk funded students. So most districts serve more students than they receive state funding for because funding is not tied to services. So the number of students eligible for a free lunch determines how much at-risk funding a district receives. But the districts determine which students will receive at-risk services, and they consider more things than just poverty. So student attendance, academic performance, and a student's social and emotional needs are often considered when determining which students should receive at-risk services. The figure on page 6 shows the comparison between the number of at-risk students served versus the number of students funded. Okay, so much like that other figure, again, there's a lot of variation across these districts. Once again, you have Blue Valley at the top, who provided services to significantly more students than they received funding for. If you go all the way down to the bottom, you'll see St. Francis, who actually received funding for more students than they provided services to. So we also looked at how districts spent their at-risk funding. So of the $162 million, the 20 districts reported spending on at-risk services, $156 million, or 96%, was for staff salaries and benefits. We asked the districts to report to us specifically which staff they paid for with at-risk funding. So of the 4,000 staff the districts reported, 91% were classroom teachers or paras. And you can see the complete breakdown of all the reported staff on page 8. So in some cases, the staff member was paid entirely with at-risk funds. In other cases, the district paid only a part of the salary using at-risk funds and then used other funding for the remainder. 19 of the 20 districts we reviewed used at-risk funds to pay for classroom teachers. This included teachers who taught core classes like math and English and science. But most districts also reported using at-risk funds to pay for teachers who taught courses such as band, choir, and PE. In terms of how teachers deliver those services, all 20 districts reported they provide in-class assistance to their at-risk students. So for example, breaking students into small groups based on skills so that teachers can address specific needs. Additionally, many districts told us that although the teachers teach all students in the classroom, they use programs and practices that are helpful for at-risk students. Then last, based on what the districts and staff at KSDE told us, in-class assistance delivered by the regular classroom teacher is the primary way at-risk services are delivered to students. So teachers use a variety of programs and practices to deliver the service to at-risk students. So we looked at the effectiveness of some of those programs and practices. So we reviewed 29 programs and practices districts told us they were using. And we looked them up on the What Works Clearinghouse. So the What Works Clearinghouse is affiliated with the Federal Department of Education, and it provides information on existing research for educational programs and practices. So our review, though, did not cover all programs or practices school districts use. It only includes those that the What Works Clearinghouse had also reviewed. So only 3 of the 29 programs and practices we reviewed were proven to be effective. So 3 of them showed clear positive effects. 11 of them showed potentially positive effects, and 15 showed either no effect or mixed results. Districts also told us they use at-risk funds to pay for classroom teachers so they can keep class sizes small. So we reviewed several studies examining the effects of small class size on student performance, and we found 2 important things. So first, research found positive effects for small class sizes in kindergarten through the 3rd grade. And students in poverty in those grades especially benefited from small class sizes. However, the results were inconclusive when looking at grades 4 through 12. Research also noted that small changes in class size were unlikely to produce positive results. So in other words, reducing class size from 25 students to 22 students is unlikely to improve student performance. Class sizes need to have 15 or fewer students to produce academic benefits to students. So we also reviewed district and at-risk expenditures to determine whether spending was related to at-risk. We reviewed about 118 expenditures totaling a little more than $5 million. The results from this work, though, are not projectable to all the districts or all their spending because the expenditures were not chosen randomly. But they were chosen to provide a wide variety in the expenditures we looked at. So the figure on page 11 shows the results. And you can see there that a small percentage of expenditures made using at-risk funds were not directly related to at-risk programs or practices. In some cases, the expenditure was for items that were general and available to all students. This included things like general math curriculums and computers. But in other cases, the expenditure was not directly related to an at-risk program, such as playground equipment or an athletic trainer. We also reviewed the list of programs and practices that state law directed the Board of Education to create. State statute directs the State Board of Education to identify and approve evidence-based practices for at-risk programs and for the instruction of at-risk students. KSDE staff compile the practices and programs, and then they maintain a web page that includes all those approved practices. We noted a couple of problems with KSDE's list as it existed in 2019. So first of all, most of the approved practices and programs were not related to at-risk programs or at-risk students as required by state law. And additionally, KSD staff could not produce research to show that the approved items were evidence-based. I'm going to talk in a lot more detail about that list when I talk about the 2023 audit. Additionally, the department did not update spending guidance to reflect new requirements for the 2019 school year, and that likely contributed to many of the problems that we found with how districts spent their at-risk funding. The last thing that we looked at in this audit had us looking at how at-risk funding, how the funding is counted compared to kind of other methods and in other states. So we reviewed a 2016 Education Commission of the States report. I did look up that report last week to see if perhaps it had been updated. Alas, it has not been updated. And so this is nearly 10 years old. I think probably lots of states still operate this way, but some of them may have changed in the last 10 years. But we found that 43 states provide at-risk funding. And of those 43 states, 38 base at-risk funding on at least one type of poverty measure. That included things like the National School Lunch Program, which is what we base our at-risk funding on, Title I, Medicaid participation, and Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program enrollment. The 5 states that did not use a poverty measure generally used academic performance to determine at-risk funding levels. And then 7 states did not provide dedicated at-risk funding to their districts at all. We also talked to stakeholders about some other possibilities for how to fund at risk. Stakeholders mentioned basing funding on the U.S. Census, but noted that it has some flaws. Most significantly, certain students who are more likely to be at risk are often not counted in the census. Stakeholders also said using academic measures, such as state assessments, can have problems. Doing so often results in reduced funding as students' academic outcomes improve. But students may still need support in order to continue that success. But the district will no longer have the funds to provide that support. The last stakeholders told us the state could use other measures, such as absenteeism or social emotional measures to determine funding. The state, though, would have to define those measures, and it would need to develop a common tool to ensure consistency across the districts. We did make some recommendations out of this audit. They're on page 18, and I will address those recommendations kind of in the next audit. So that concludes the 2019 audit. All right, give me just a moment here. Okay, the next audit. released in 2023, and it was a follow-up to the 2019 audit. The questions, it was 2 questions, and they are on page 2. So the first work we did in this audit was examining the list of approved practices and programs. So as I mentioned before, statute requires the State Board of Education to publish a list of evidence-based at-risk practices and programs. And statute requires the programs on that list to be for at-risk educational programs and for the instruction of at-risk students. Further, each program on the list must be based on peer-reviewed research that shows the program produced better student outcomes over a 5-year period than would otherwise be achieved. And that 5-year period has changed since this audit. It is now 1 year. So, we evaluated 40 programs that were on the approved list for the 22 school year. We chose some of the programs randomly, and then we chose others because we saw that the districts were using them. Again, our results can't be projected because we didn't choose all of them randomly. We looked for evidence of effectiveness, again, at the What Works Clearinghouse, and then also at evidence for ESSA. These are sources the department uses as well, and both websites review and aggregate evidence related to effectiveness for a variety of educational programs. So statute required that programs included on the approved list must be evidence-based. Statute defined evidence-based as peer-reviewed research that shows the program produced better outcomes over a 5-year period than would otherwise be achieved. And then statute also required that the program be for at-risk programs and at-risk students. So we reviewed 40 programs to determine if they met the statutory criteria. None of the 40 programs met all 3 criteria. For 22 of them, the programs we reviewed, we could not find any peer-reviewed research. For 17, the programs had peer-reviewed research, but the research did not evaluate students over that 5-year period. One program, though, did meet the statutory evidence-based requirement, but it wasn't for at-risk. So we then reviewed those same 40 programs and practices again, but in a slightly different way. So we reviewed the research to determine if the programs had any peer-reviewed evidence of effectiveness. So basically, we're looking to see, are those 40 programs effective? Overall, the quality of the evidence for those 40 programs was very poor. So again, for 22 of them, more than half, we could not find any peer-reviewed research. For the 18 programs we could find peer-reviewed research, for 6 of them, the research indicated the program was not effective or had only very weak evidence of effectiveness. 5 programs had mixed results, and 7, though, did have moderate to strong evidence of effectiveness. So we think this is important because the purpose of an evidence-based list of at-risk programs is to ensure that districts spend their funding on programs that are effective. So when the department approves programs that lack quality evidence, districts may waste their resources on programs that may not work. And as a result, at-risk students may not receive the services that they need to effectively address their needs. So at that time, KSD officials told us that they plan to have a new list of approved programs ready for the 24-25 school year. So that was the school year that we just finished. And they told us that they planned to have higher standards for the programs they included on that new list. We also noted that many approved programs did not appear to meet the purpose of at-risk programs. Statute defines the purpose of at-risk programs as providing opportunities, interventions, and services that are above and beyond regular education services. And statute does use that term, above and beyond. So many of the programs on the approved list were designed for all students. Based on the statute, we expected programs to provide at-risk students an above and beyond opportunity or service, as is mentioned in state law. So many programs on the approved list are general education opportunities available to all students. For example, the approved list included virtual schools, dual credit courses, and Khan Academy. Some programs on the approved list were general teaching strategies for use in any classroom and for all students. So for example, co-teaching and project-based learning. And a few programs were actually assessment tools that districts routinely use to assess all of their students. Department officials agreed with us that some of those general programs were not appropriate for inclusion on an at-risk program list, and that they were unlikely to approve them again for the following list. So I'd like to note here that KSDE did issue a new list for the 24-25 school year. Again, that year has just finished, but we have not reviewed that list. So much like the 2019 audit, we also looked at district at-risk expenditures. And I'm on page 9. So we reviewed the accounting records again for 20 districts for their at-risk funds for the 22 school year to determine how they spent those funds. So we chose 10 districts from our previous audit and then 10 new districts. And we selected the districts just to provide a good cross-section of all Kansas school districts. So most of the nearly $176 million the 20 districts spent in the 22 school year was for salaries and benefits. Overall, 97% of expenditures were for salaries and benefits. This was very similar to what we found in 2019. The figure on page 11 shows what types of staff that districts reported paying from their at-risk fund. As you can see in that figure, about 90% of them were instructional staff. And again, that was very similar to what we saw in 2019. So from 2019 to 2023, it did not appear that districts made significant changes to how they spent their at-risk funding. We also reviewed expenditures to determine if they were allowable under state law. So state law requires that all expenditures from the at-risk fund be for approved programs or the educational staff, training, or contracted services related to an approved program. For 71% of the 179 items we reviewed, they were related to a program on the department's list of approved at-risk programs. For 11 of the 20 districts, all of the expenditures we reviewed were related to a program on the list. That included expenditures for things like teachers and paras who were using approved programs, software, and training related, again, to an approved program. However, 29% of the expenditures we evaluated were not allowable. Unallowable items included things such as salary and benefits for food service or clerical staff, TVs, Sam's Club memberships, food, and office equipment. These items were not allowable because they were not directly related to KSDE-approved at-risk programs or their educational staff, training, or contracted services. So as I mentioned before, statute says the purpose of at-risk programs is to provide that above and beyond educational opportunity to at-risk students. But it was unclear how much of the district's at-risk spending actually targets at-risk students or provides them that above and beyond opportunity. We identified a few reasons that this may happen. So first of all, the inclusion of broad and general programs on the approved at-risk program list means that many expenditures are unlikely to offer an additional opportunity. So for example, Go Math is a general math curriculum, but it is on the approved list of at-risk programs. So districts can use at-risk funds to pay teacher salaries for any teacher using Go Math. But if the district uses Go Math as its regular math curriculum, then that may result in at-risk funds being used for general curriculum rather than for services that provide at-risk students an additional opportunity. Additionally, most districts spent most of their at-risk funds on teachers and paras. If teachers and paras are providing additional services within the classroom, such as small group work or one-on-one work, these could represent additional opportunities for at-risk students. However, simply paying regular classroom teachers and paras with at-risk funds simply as a matter of course does not ensure that at-risk students will receive additional services. And last, many districts' processes for spending at-risk funds did not directly connect spending to providing an above and beyond service. Nearly all of the districts we reviewed used their at-risk funds to pay for a portion of teachers and para salaries. Most of the districts told us they based that portion on the percentage of students who are at risk in their classroom or, in some cases, in the building. So, for example, if 30% of the students are at risk in the school, then they paid 30% of their teacher salaries from at-risk funds. However, this method does not connect spending to providing any particular service to at-risk students. And as a result, it does not ensure that at-risk students will receive additional services. I should also note that this audit showed many of the same problems as in our 2019 audit, and none of our recommendations had been adequately implemented, at least at the time that we completed this audit. So the last work we did involved evaluating outcomes for at-risk students. So students take state assessments periodically from 3rd grade through 11th grade. Students take the English language arts and math assessment every year in grades 3 through 8 and in the 10th grade. And students take the science assessment in 5th grade, 8th grade, and 11th grade. So student scores are placed in 1 of 4 performance levels for each year. And those levels are on the top of page 16. Okay. So we examined state assessment scores for English language arts, math, and science provided by the Department of Education. We compared the scores of students who were eligible for free lunches to those students who were not eligible for free lunch. So we reviewed scores for school years 2017 through 2022, but students did not take a state assessment in 2020 due to COVID-related school closures. So the data, though, that we used did not have an indicator for which students received at-risk services. However, it did indicate which students were eligible for free lunch. So although free lunch is not an exact indicator for which students received at-risk services, it is a good proxy. So figure 3, which is on page 17, shows the average score for students in ELA, math, and science from school years 2017 to 2022. So as you can see in that figure, between 17 and 19, the average state assessment scores for all students and for all subjects remained steady or declined just a little bit. However, the decline became more pronounced in 2021. We used a regression model and a t-test to analyze the significance in that change in average test scores between 2017 and 2019, and then 21 and 22. And the results showed a statistically significant decline in average test scores. This may be related to COVID-related issues. Students eligible for free lunch performed worse than other students in all subjects and in all 5 years. The figure shows for students eligible for free lunch, they typically lagged behind other students by about a half a level. We also tracked state assessment scores of 4 cohorts of students for several years. So we compared how those students did on state assessments in the first year they took it with how they did in the last. So for example, we looked at 3rd grade students in the 16-17 school year, and then 8th grade students in the 22 school year. So we only included students who appeared in every year in the analysis. So basically, we're looking at the same group of kids over time. So the proportion of all students scoring at level 1 increased over time. The trend was more pronounced for students eligible for free lunch. So as you can see in the figure that's on page 19, in math, 38% of students eligible for a free lunch scored at level 1 in the first year we evaluated. Several years later, that percentage increased to 67% for that same group of students. We saw a similar trend for students not eligible for free lunch, but it was less pronounced. Very few students scored better over time. So for example, in math, only about 7% of all students scored better over time. So this means that the vast majority of students either scored at the same level or at a lower level over the years that we analyzed. We also looked at graduation rates, which is on page 20. So graduation rates for free lunch students were lower than the rates for other students across all 6 years that we evaluated. As the figure shows, students eligible for free lunch graduated at lower rates than students not eligible. However, the gap is narrowing. So in 2017, there was a 17% difference between the two groups. By 2022, the gap had narrowed to 14% because graduation rates for students who were eligible for free lunch improved. Then last, we looked at ACT scores, and that is on page 21. So overall, from 2017 to 2022, the average ACT score declined for all high school seniors. During the years we evaluated, the average ACT score for high school seniors eligible for free lunch was lower than the average for other students. So as you can see in that figure, the gap between those two groups was consistently about 4 points across all the years that we evaluated. So I'm going to conclude with just a couple of points. So first of all, we looked at at-risk twice in 4 years, and despite calling out problems in 2019, not much had changed by 2023. Second, we spent time looking at and talking about KSD's approved program and practice list because it is so critical. That list drives at-risk spending and the programs and the practices that districts use. So if that list includes programs that are not effective or don't facilitate additional opportunities for at-risk students, then at-risk spending is likely to be unfocused and ineffective. So that concludes both of my presentations. I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Heidi, appreciate it. What questions do we have? Director Rooker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So there have been changes since the 23 audit, but just staying in this world for a minute, it seems to me that, especially highlighted by the reviser's presentation, differentiating how the weighting and the funding is generated from how those funds are spent and which students generate the funding versus which students need the services. If I look at the audit and the review of outcomes, and it seems to me this has done a really beautiful job of evaluating the impact poverty has on student outcomes, but that it is divorced from any kind of evaluation of how the students who have those needs and risk factors are doing. And I think that is something we need to keep in mind. I believe there is an impact that we should be paying attention to that, in terms of the context that a student living in poverty inhabits and the disruptions and things in their lives. But I am not comfortable jumping to a conclusion about whether the at-risk funding is appropriately addressing the needs of the students with the risk factors based on the test scores of the cohort that qualifies for free lunch. Would you care to comment?
A couple of things. First of all, there is a fair amount of overlap between students who are free lunch and students who receive at-risk services. It is not complete overlap, but it is a lot of overlap. I think it's around 70%. But second, at the time that we did this audit, there was no at-risk flag in the data. The kids' data simply did not tell us who got at-risk services and who got free lunch, or versus how those two things overlapped. It told us who got free lunch, so that was the only data available to us. I believe that has now changed, and kids does have a flag that has some sort of flag for at-risk services. I think Dr. Harwood could probably elaborate on exactly what that flag is indicating, but it is there now. We just have not had an audit that would let us cut that data in a different way. So in 2023, this was the best analysis available, but potentially there is another analysis that could be done. We just haven't had an audit to do it.
I just want to, as we are deliberating, I think that is an important factor for us to think about as we're making judgments. Thank you.
So along those lines, just a couple of comments. We know that there's a problem with the proxy for funding versus the services being provided to students. That's always been an issue with how we do things. Just because it's so much easier just to use the proxy of free lunch for the funding versus the services. However, I would point out the validity of these audits ought to be jaw-dropping, and the results of this ought to be jaw-dropping to anyone who truly wants to take a look at this. Whatever factors are causing the disconnect between the nearly $500 million that we appropriate and use for at-risk students, however you want to slice it, I would love for someone to please show me any outcomes, any test score, any objective measure that shows that those funds are being used to actually produce improved student outcomes for kids. So we can argue about whether it's poverty or this, but the fact is we pour $500 million into at-risk funding each year and apparently have no objective measure of showing that. But to your audit point, what should be alarming is that there was apparently, and I would like to know if this is not the case, no corrective action taken. There were half of the districts were the same as, I believe, in both audits, half. And yet there was no correction made with the issues that were found in the audit. Is that accurate?
So there's potentially two things that I think you may be getting at. One is we made some recommendations in 2019 to the Department of Education. Those recommendations were not adequately implemented by the time we came back and looked at them in 2023. As far as the districts go, so the overlap was about half. We looked at the same, there are 10 districts in the same. So I can't speak to any one specific district, but I can say for the 20 districts we looked at in 2019 and the 20 districts we looked at again in 2023, their spending, how they spent their money was almost exactly down to 1% point. And so that would indicate to us that there was not a big shift in how the districts spent their money across those 4 years.
That alone ought to be shocking and be addressed. That alone. So going back to the issue of poverty, and there's no doubt that is an impact on an at-risk factor for kids. But my question would be if over time, and we are now at 509 million, I believe, in at-risk funding a year, how much money does it take to offset the factor of poverty? That would be the question for this task force. If 500 million isn't enough, how much, and how will we know it's effective and going to the services? If districts aren't adjusting after being pointed out where they need to make adjustments in their at-risk spending per the audits, they're going to continue to spend on salaries and not above and beyond services. I would propose that no amount of funding is going to right that ship or help our educational outcomes. So whether you say, well, maybe this didn't measure the right thing or not, the fact that these issues were pointed out and there's been no corrective action, to me, is alarming and needs to be addressed. Representative Estes and then Representative Williams.
Heidi, I'm trying to reconcile something in my mind. When I look at page 19 and I look at page 20, all right, we see in English language arts, there's 11% higher in a level 1 from your beginning to your end. In math, it's 29%. Science, it's 17%. Then I look at what the definition of level 1 is, and that's a very limited proficiency. How are we able to graduate more kids who have a limited proficiency? Do you have a mathematical way to make that make sense to me, or did you observe anything in the audit that would help me?
Unfortunately, no, we cannot connect those two things, but we did, that is the trend we saw. We see over time, the number of students who are in that lowest level, that level 1, it does increase over time. We do see an increased number of kids graduating, though, out of that same group. There is an increased number of kids graduating from high school. So you're recognizing both trends accurately, but as to why specifically we see more graduation when we might think we shouldn't, I don't have an answer for that question.
Thank you.
Representative Williams.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So I really am focusing on page 19 of the second audit, where you look at the cohort group, and that is something that the legislature has been trying to get a partnership with KSD for quite some time, is really to follow students. So I love that you actually did that in one audit. And we see a huge difference. And it seems like what we're finding over and over is the longer students are in school, the worse they're doing. Is there any case that you have seen where that has not been the case?
I would say if you look on page 18, that very last bullet kind of addresses that issue, which is we called out just math, but we saw it across all three subjects that we looked at, where we find that just very, very few students, single-digit percentage of students, improve over time. Now, that may be because they started out as a 4. There's nowhere else to go. If they started out as a 3, that's still pretty good, and even if they don't climb further, as long as they don't slide back, that's still pretty good too. But for those students in those 1s and 2s, very few of them are going to move over the course of their academic career.
And Madam Chair, my only last comment is, we had just gone to a conference where the whole premise of the conference was all funding always should be tied to outcomes. And if we look at this, and I think last time we met, I advocated, why are we even doing it at risk? Let's just give them the money because it's not doing anything. We could continue your audit and we could look at the data that I'm looking at right now for at risk, and I could see that we continue to get worse. 45.3% of all of our students that are free and reduced lunch in ELA are below grade level. That's just below grade level. And I also just looked up ACT scores, and Kansas total scores composite has now dropped to 19.4. And that is, so something's not working, and I'm just shocked that we're continuing to do the same old thing and adding more money and getting worse results. So I hope that our new formula will address incentivizing better outcomes.
Representative Brantley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I'm filling in today, but I have a question. How many years does it take to show progress and get these kids to grade level? If we've gone 4 years in this audit and it shows they've gotten worse, do you add another 5 years and hope that something changes and that progress is made? How many years do we continue this downward spiral for our kids? You've got to, if it's in 19, a student was a freshman, and 4 years later, they're out of school. They've not progressed any. We're doing a disservice. How many years does it take?
I don't think our audit really answers that question, but I can say that, when we looked at these cohorts, we looked for several years. So it wasn't even just 4 years. In often cases, if we're looking at, say, a 3rd grade cohort, we're looking at them for several years. So we look at them for the first time in 3rd grade. The next time we look at them, they're in high school. And yet we see that the percentage of them in that lowest level is growing. And so over several years, for a lot of them, things are not improving.
Other questions? Yes, Chair Hopkins.
Just a comment if I can. I got on the board in January of '23, so this is all pretty much predating me. So I'm just going to quickly speak to what we're doing now, which is working very hard with the at-risk lists, adding trainings specific to the newest part of the legislation, adding the IDA accreditation as well as the MSLEC, working very hard to get better training available to our educators, because I do believe personally that that's where we make a huge impact, is by getting our educators better trained in specifically reading. And I do want to just speak to the What Works Clearinghouse, because I'm a little frustrated with that website, because it doesn't even include IDA accredited programs. So to me, that was a little like a what? So I'm not a huge fan of lists anyway, but in trying to work with that, we are definitely working very hard at the state board level, taking it very seriously. As chair, that is a huge, huge thing for me. So I can't speak to past audits, but I can speak to today what I am passionate about and what this current board is working very hard to do. So just wanted to throw that out there. So thank you.
Yes, Director Rooker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I first would piggyback and say the audit found the standard was not meetable, and it's what led to legislative action to amend and address and update that evidence-based criteria. So I think contextually, again, that matters, that yes, there were findings that the 5-year peer-reviewed What Works Clearinghouse, that criteria was not being met and nothing had changed. It couldn't change, and that was acknowledged. The audit itself said the 5-year requirement significantly reduces the number of programs that can meet that aspect of statutory compliance, and that the definition was unduly narrow. So I think there was legislative attention paid, and that helps the state board do the work that's expected of that. I think I want to talk about the cohort review and just flag that it used. I mean, appreciate that approach to looking at things, but the time frame you had to work with started in 2017. We were rewriting, we were replacing a block grant and no funding distribution model. We had to rewrite a version of the formula. That work happened in 2017, which would have begun to take effect in the 17-18 school year. We also, as a legislature, chose a phase-in plan that took, in 2018, we amended, and in 2019, it got amended again. It was a total of 6 different school years that it took to ramp up funding to the levels determined to meet the adequacy component, and then finally connect some dots to the cost analysis delivered to the legislature in 2017 told us what it would take to meet the objectives of the State Department of Education versus what maintaining effort at current levels. And we really ended up landing on the maintenance of effort plan. So it is not to diminish the amount of funding that has had to be appropriated to phase in to meet the standards. It's a lot of money. It is not the amount of money that the experts that were evaluating what it would take to meet the aspirational goals told us it would take. And so I'm not gonna tag the wouldn't you agree or would you care to comment to make it a question. I apologize for pontificating, but I just think that needs to be said. The 2023 school year is the first year that ought to become our new benchmark year moving forward, evaluating, because that is the year we achieved the legislative responsibility to meet the Gannon settlement amount. So that's I think perspective that ought to be part of the conversation as well. Thank you for indulging.
I would just say that to say that the list was somehow restricted because of the 5-year requirement. We know from testimony in Senate and House Education Committees that I've sat on for 7 years that districts were using at-risk, they were purchasing programs that weren't on the list, and they were being added after the fact to try to comply. So it was a backwards process with what was going on. So to say that the reason we aren't seeing, one of the reasons is because the list was so restricted by the 5-year requirement, I think is just not what actually happened in school districts. And to say that any amount of money, additional money, I mean, you look at the weightings that have increased. So it would tell us that if we're increasing the amount of funding, regardless of some magic number that's supposed to be, well, that's when it was fully funded, we should be seeing somewhere in some demographic on some level an improvement in student outcomes. That hasn't happened. It's been quite the opposite, as your audit shows. It's been a decrease. And it still does not excuse the fact that how those funds are spent, how the funds are spent, not how much. is the heart of this audit. And when the audit very clearly shows that the funds are not being spent, according to statute, are not being spent on the programs that they should be, according to statute, no additional amount of funding, if we continue those practices, are going to improve outcomes for students. We cannot continue to buy Sam's memberships and TVs and prom decorations and say it's the amount that matters. Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I'm sitting and listening, you know, I've studied poverty, kids with poverty. I've taught only in schools with kids with poverty. And I think about high mobility rates. I think about absenteeism. And when I look at your audit, and I've had presentations on this before, so it's not as fresh in my brain as it was. I don't really see like a complete list of which districts they weren't randomly chosen. I don't see a number of total students. So this lacks a little specificity for me, and I echo Director Rooker's, some of her concerns, but I do think this is a good piece of the puzzle to look at, and I appreciate all the work that your department does and your patience with us today.
I do want to note that the outcomes part of the 2023 was all students. So that was not limited to the 20 districts. It's all students across all the state, across the entire state. The money, looking at the counting, you know, looking at how much money was spent, looking at how it was spent, that is confined to 20 districts. So.
Dr. Gibson.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Just a few things. One is when you're writing a research dissertation, one of the things I remember is you have multiple hypotheses, right? And one of the things we might have to keep in mind is, although none of us may be satisfied with the results we're seeing, there might be a hypothesis that without the funding we have, we actually could see diminishing results. So that's something that's possible. A couple things, a statement that maybe I wonder. One is, as a practitioner, I can verify that KSDE and Dr. Harwood has drilled it into our mind this year about appropriate use of at-risk. On multiple occasions has talked about above and beyond. And so I know this shift is happening in mindset, and although I know it's just 1 year in, I do foresee that there's different changes happening that I believe will result in changes. The other thing I'm wondering a little bit about is we often rely on whether it be ACT or state assessment results, and there's different intentions for each assessment. And I'm wondering if the practitioner side, if there's other measures that are being used locally. For example, FastBridge might be better for longitudinal or growth looks, because as I understand the state assessment, it was never meant to be longitudinal and review. But that's just my understanding, but it might be something the committee wonders about or thinks about is, can we get more information about the intentions and then now recalibration of those results? Thank you.
Thank you. I would just also ask, because I'm hearing a lot of reasons as to why the data that we're looking at, why what we're being presented with isn't what we're actually seeing. So I would just ask, then what would indicate? What is the measure? How much money? Because all I'm hearing is, well, this isn't valid. And so I find that kind of a difficult mindset, especially for this committee. If we cannot look at the objective measures and not have any other tangible way of assessing whether the funds we're spending are getting the desired outcomes, that's, to me, problem number one. If we can't measure the impact of what we're doing, and anything that we do try, i.e. the post-audit, which does examine it, is somehow ruled invalid, then tell me what would work. What can we agree on that would lead us down a path to get what our at-risk students need? What would satisfy all of the stakeholders to say, yes, that would work? Because to me, to try to defend or poke holes in this is just indefensible, whether you like it or not. The fact that it wasn't changed, the fact that accreditation for districts, they are supposed to follow state law. This audit shows that that is not happening in many instances from 2019 to 2023. That alone, I mean, that should be alarming. And so set this aside, I'm asking this task force, if not what we're currently using, then what would satisfy making sure our at-risk kids are getting the services and then it's producing the outcomes that we all want for our kids? Because all I'm hearing is why what we're doing isn't right. And the measures we're using can't really be telling us what they're telling us. So that's my question for this task force. Director Ricker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would just like to stipulate that I would agree. I too would like to see better outcomes. I think it's just the framing of this that districts are breaking the law when the law at the time of that assessment was unmeetable because of the 5-year peer-reviewed must be in the What Works Clearinghouse database. I think that is casting a willful disobedience on districts that are trying to, I believe that any district in the state that we ask is trying to do right by their students. The idea of what it will take, I think, is multifaceted, and I think there are very valuable assessment tools that I would leave the educators in the room to better describe than I can. But the single state assessment or, a particular single isolated metric is when we begin to, we have to be honest about the limitations of that particular evaluation tool and put them into a universe of metrics that tell us how our kids are doing and whether there is growth and improvement over time. A student who is at the low level of level 2 has chronic absenteeism or is homeless or whatever the risk factor is, who is assisted and improves and maybe catches up to the high level of level 2, we are blind to that in the data set we're looking at, the state assessment score. But that maybe was Herculean effort made by that school over the context of a given time frame. And I want us to be focused on how to ensure we are providing the right resources, providing the right set of expectations. That is all the responsibility of the legislative process. There also is more to it that it isn't a black and white issue, and we're going to have to get comfortable with the contextual factors. I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but the risk factors that our students are contending with that impact these outcomes create an uncomfortable amount of variability. I would just put that out there, that sometimes take more time and require interventions that aren't necessarily what is defined in statute at the moment as above and beyond services. Maybe it is Go Math, that is a program that, sure, all students can participate in that math curriculum, but perhaps it also can be tailored to the student that is struggling with math to go at their pace and help bring them along. Like, it may be, those types of tools may be applicable in a general ed capacity, which an at-risk student is first and foremost, but also provide features that allow for some differentiated learning. So I think if we can pull back from the accusations that there is intent to ignore what is expected, it would help me navigate this process as a member of this task force. Anyway, thank you.
So to clarify, on page 11 of the 2023 audit. About 30% of the 5.2 million in expenditures we reviewed did not adhere to statutory spending rules. That's not me making an accusation. That's a fact. After it being pointed out in 2019. So if you hear that as an accusation, if we can't look at the facts of a nonpartisan legislative post-audit that says they did not follow statutory spending guidelines, then I'm sorry you're offended by that, but I'm not offended for saying exactly what the audit showed. And it seems to me, we are on a funding task force, and it seems to me the only one absolute is that people can, boy, they can tell us they know for sure we need more money. That's what they know for sure. We have produced the more money. We are fully funding our schools. And then for some reason we are told, well, then we can't get the outcomes that we are funding. As the legislature, we are going to expect those outcomes. Now, how we get there, that's what we can do as a task force to try to direct those resources to get the student outcomes. But the purpose of at-risk funding is to improve academic student outcomes. And I have yet to hear anyone show me any objective measure that would show that the funds we're using are accomplishing that. That's the goal of this task force. How can we use that, those hundreds of millions of dollars, to get the outcomes that we want for our students? That's statute. If you take offense at statute, then you're just going to have to be offended. Because I want to see that. Now, we can talk about whether that's state assessment, whether that's Fast Bridge. I think those are all valid discussions. But what's not up for discussion is we want more money, and we're not going to have any kind of objective measure that shows we're getting improved student outcomes. So that's the context of my comments. Senator Petty.
Well, I'm sorry, Madam Chair. I did not take away that from, I mean, these audits are important as we look at the whole picture, but I don't think they are the end-all, be-all of decision-making for where we're moving forward with the school finance formula. So I did not hear in the comments that were being made by other members of this committee or questions that were being asked, the very negative tone that it appears that you heard. And I have to say, I don't, and I've been serving on Senate Ed for, I think, longer than you, but just because I've been there that long. But I believe school districts are working to do the best they can, and it seems if we're looking at this and making a decision about funding, that this is one piece of it, and this is, and, you know, as it was mentioned by Representative McDonald, we cannot ignore poverty, and we cannot ignore the impact that poverty has. We, to this point, have spent hardly any time talking about the importance of early childhood education and how the impact it could be having on if we were providing it for more than the small percentage of students that we are right now, to what the impact it would have over time on our families. So I think that we need to look at this in the light that it is. It's one piece of information to help us to be making good decisions, and at-risk funding is very important to our school districts because of the number of students that we do have at risk.
I will repeat. If not this, what? If not the measures we're using, then what? I'm open, but I have yet to anyone say, well, this is the objective measure that will help us get a more accurate picture. I'm open to that, but absent of that, we're going with what we have. Representative Getz.
I appreciate the conversation. I think, you know, looking back at the survey that was done, and I know they were financial folks that were looking at what's the what student weighting in the current school system formula has the biggest impact on our school districts. Picked at risk. We're having a good, vibrant debate about, well, what does that mean? And saying, and I think it's important that if that's the biggest deal at the district level and they're looking at that, there better be a congruent mindset of what that means, of what that is doing. So I don't know that I have an answer for you, but a positive that I didn't notice when I saw this the first time is those set in the 2023 report, those 7 programs that had moderate to strong evidence of effectiveness. And I kind of missed it the first time I saw it, but today I saw it and it made me wonder. And it goes on to say the U.S. housing, and this is on page 7 of the 23, second little bullet point at the top. Human Services rated parents as teachers as a well-supported practice. It also noted that research had found a sustained favorable effect for at least 12 months. 12 months of sustained effect is a big deal. It's a helpful thing. But that's one portion, and this is where I'll do a little bit more research, but maybe you or the department, what were those other 7? Did we double down on those as a possible, like, hey, what could help fix this to get the best outcomes with the most important from the district that they see as a route to helping students and helping the district? Do you have any comments around what those other 7 were, or the department? Because I'm interested now and I'm intrigued. If we doubled down on those and pushed away some other things that were not working and said, yes, we want to make these work.
I don't know what the 7 were off the top of my head, other than parents as teachers, but I can get a list of what those 7 were. Now, whether or not the districts are continuing to use those programs or increasing their usage of those 7 programs over time, that I will not be able to tell you. But I can tell you what those programs were.
I'd appreciate seeing it. I think it would be an interesting look at definitely something I missed, but that showed a positive, right, kind of inside of a bit of a negative, and maybe a little bit of a spot where we're not in agreement on this, but I think we're all in agreement that at-risk funding and that it is a large dollar amount, for one, and that we really care about those kids. Like, I think everybody could shake their head yes to that. And so what is that measure that we could all agree on? And I think that's what the chair is really trying to get at, and hearing heart, but also having the difficult conversation that, of course, we don't necessarily agree on all this information, but it raises maybe in this task force that if we can't get to a consensus on this, we might not really be getting to any sort of workable consensus, because this is a big part of it, of moving students that are not doing well in a better direction. When we think tying money to outcomes, it's not a reward system for some and a demotion for others. It's we want to see this thing working well, and I think everybody wants that. And like I said, I didn't think I was going to have an answer, but what were those 7? I appreciate that feedback, and the only thing I just wanted to say was I think this is really important, that if everybody could lean in and try and find that place where we could have a consensus, like the chair is challenging us towards, this would be a big deal to get to a point of, I do respect some of this information, and here's how we plan to solve it. That will be huge. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Getz, I always appreciate your optimism and your efforts to try to get us back on a positive mindset. You know, I was thinking a little bit about, I have a special needs son, and so I know that districts go far out of their way to do inclusion and make sure that he is a part of. And sometimes when I see limitations on how districts can spend money, I worry, and I want us to always be mindful to not pull, like say, pull out the ELL kids all into one classroom, right? Because that is counterproductive. But if it's like an accounting decision, let's look more broadly. So that was just a top level thought. And then when I look at how districts spent the money, I don't remember if it was this study or the one before, I was thinking about how the biggest expense districts have is salaries. So that may be part of what we're seeing. You know, we're getting a chunk of money. How can we don't want to lose the money. Lower class sizes do matter. And I appreciated how this, to the positivity note, I appreciated how this articulated that small changes might not make as big a difference statistically as larger changes in class size. That's something I hadn't considered. And I think that's probably all that I had, but thank you.
Anyone else? Oh, I'm sorry, Representative Estes.
I even put myself on the list. Forgot my sticky notes today. I have to bring them tomorrow. So this has been an interesting conversation for me because I think we have two different things that we're talking about. One of the things that we're talking about is tracking students kind of with their cohort, and I'm hoping that that's something, I've heard that mentioned from a lot of different people and a lot of that, you know, we have to kind of take where's a child when they come in the door and in the fall and when they leave our classroom at the end of the year, where are they? What impact have we been able to make? And I think that's one discussion, and we're talking about multiple ways to measure. I think those multiple ways are very important. I agree with adding formatives. And I hear conversations about context. What is that child's absenteeism? How often have they moved? I think it's appropriate to try to accommodate those things in how we measure. And so that's one conversation that we're having. I think another conversation that we're having is accountability. And I think that's really important because the legislators here, we literally take money out of somebody's pocket and put it in another, into the government system, and we hope that it does what we want it to do. And I think we have a moral obligation that's happening, that we're using money very wisely. So when we think about those two things, I'd like to go back to the first idea of multiple measures, looking at cohorts, and looking at contextual factors. And I really do sincerely want to ask the question, is there a system out there that does that? Is this a wheel we need to invent for ourselves? Because I think we have to measure. We are trying so many different things right now. We may measure a few things that fail. I'm okay with the failure as long as we don't let it go on too long and we learn something from that failure and come up with a new theory or a new approach that we want to take, and we can apply the lessons that we've learned, because you learn more from your bad experiences actually than you do from your positive experiences. So sincerely I ask, is there a measurement system out there that does some of the things that we would like it to do that we're aware of?
I have a thought. There is research, this idea floats around in the research community, and in fact, I think there is research that has done exactly this, but it's called a growth model. So it takes a student and says, here's where you are at the beginning of the school year. Did you make a year's worth of growth in that school year? If you made at least a year's worth of growth, 2 thumbs up. That's exactly what we expected. If you didn't make a year's worth of growth, of course, why aren't you? And so it kind of gets rid of that concept of every kid needs to be exactly in this spot at 3rd grade, and accommodates, hey, kids have lots of things going on at home that might affect where they're at. Their previous school experience affects, kindergarten through 3rd grade affects where you are at 4th grade. And the 4th grade teacher doesn't necessarily control anything about what happened in kindergarten through 3rd grade. So it says we look at where you start and we look at where you end, and is there a year's worth of growth there? Now, a couple of things. Measuring a year's worth of growth can be difficult. What exactly is a year's worth of growth? There's a lot of ways to measure that, so that can be a little bit difficult. The other is it does not get you past the idea that, hey, a 5th grader made a year's worth of growth this year. Great, but they're still at a 2nd grade reading level. Okay, so it doesn't give you kind of both sides, but potentially you can look at both sides. But it is another way of looking at it. It has been floating around for a while in the research. I think there are school districts that kind of look at that. I think Fastbridge can add to that, and they are using some of that data to do that. We don't have data at the state level that does a great job of measuring that growth. Not saying it's an easy thing, but it is something out there, and it's been out there for a while, and it may be a possibility. It may address some of the things here.
Thank you, Holly. And I think that's what we talk about, and I think that's the importance of us talking about cohort measurements, because that gives us that individual progress. I also think our levels are broad, and sometimes we ask the department to break things down to a high 1 and a low 1 and a high 3 and a low 3 and so on. And I find that helps us to see that movement. So I sincerely, the question is sincerely on the table of how can we get to where we need to be on measurement, because we have to be responsible for the dollars that we're spending. May I call in Director?
I appreciate those comments because I think we would all agree. I'm just trying to ensure there is credit and acknowledgement for the work that has happened since 2023 when this audit was written. So at the time, I think you began your presentation with acknowledgement that there has been additional effort. I think Chair Hopkins has shared some of the board perspective. I'm just trying to say, freezing the world at what the conditions in the 19 and 23 audits and not acknowledge, there has been hard legislative work done to address the narrowness of the statute, to put a pilot plan in place to study cohorts of students. The literacy work, the framework that's been put in place, Mississippi did that in 2013. Today, 12 years later, we're starting to acknowledge, wow, that was really something, the effect that has had. These things take some time, and so I think maybe a more accurate presentation of representation of what I'm trying to say is a little patience with the work it takes, the time it takes to move human outcomes. Help me, child development specialists, weigh in, because these are things that it's not just turning up the speed on the assembly line. This is change that has to happen. It requires partnership, and when we are not thinking in terms of how the various cogs fit together, I think we do a disservice on all fronts. So I appreciate that acknowledgement. I do believe there are ways to hold standards of accountability while also acknowledging we are dealing with the human condition that is affected by a variety of different factors. So thank you.
So I guess my question would be, in all sincerity, how long? How many students are not going to be able to read at grade level? How many students are not getting their needs met? I hear this all the time. What happens is, and coming from an education world and education background, teachers who've been in the classroom for a while know that one of the mantras is, this too shall pass, because there's a cycle of new initiatives, new programs that are supposed to, and always with the caveat, but we won't see any impact for 3 to 5 years. And then in 3 to 5 years, there's going to be another new sparkly thing to jump on in the education world. It's how it's worked. And my question is, how many more years, how many more students, how many more cohorts of kids are we going to be patient while they are not getting the academic, not getting the support they need? How many more? We have to have a sense of urgency. If our crisis in literacy tells us nothing, that's exactly what it should tell us. It is a sense of urgency, an emergency, and our kids deserve, to me, one cohort of kids is too many. When we have been at this narrative, we've been trying to close the achievement gap for literally decades. We've been throwing trillions of dollars at the war on poverty. We cannot continue to use that as a reason as to why our kids can't achieve. And this group needs to figure it out, because there is a sense of urgency. Our kids, and you look at the data, any data, I'm not defending anyone as the end-all be-all, but any of our data is pointing to that. Formatives, summatives, ACT, NAEP, any of our social emotional metrics are saying that. So if we can acknowledge the very definition of insanity is continuing doing the same thing over and over, and this task force doesn't have the courage to say, maybe there's some things we can do differently and with a sense of urgency to help our kids, then that's going to be my challenge, and I'm going to keep repeating it. Representative Estes, then Representative Williams.
So, Director, I just wanted to come back and say, I don't think what I'm hearing is we're very far apart, and correct me if I'm wrong. We both want an accountable, measurable system that's dispassionate. It can be quantified in numbers. We want it to be multifaceted, and we want it to take in context. Okay, thank you.
Senator Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to, again, just stick to the facts, no comments about anything, but I'm just going to kind of rebut your comments with just data. We received this nice little chart from research that showed the percent of our students on free and reduced lunch. And if I look at the year that Gannon began around 2010, we had 47.4% of our students. It jumps up to 50% at one point, and now we're at 49%. So the number of kids in poverty is pretty much the same throughout that time period, with some bumps up and down. And so that's not the issue. We're still dealing with the same number of percentage of students in poverty. Then we look at the money. We've talked about, okay, well, now we added more money, but based on the information we were provided with at our last task force meeting, we've consistently always outpaced inflation in our spending for K-12, even when we were in the midst of the lawsuit. We still outpaced inflation. And I just pulled up a report here that talks about Kansas spending since 1995, and we have spent, we're outpacing inflation by $9.6 billion. So if we just kept with inflation over that period of time, we'd be spending $9.6 billion less, and a nice big piece of that is education. And I think what you're hearing the chair say, and what you're hearing many of us, because we're exhausted with it, is I think we'd write you a blank check if we could get results. But we haven't been able to get any results, and we keep pouring money in, and so we can't just keep doing the same thing. And then basically, our investment has to give us outcomes. And if it's not, then we're doing it wrong. And nothing in the world's gonna, change that. And the data's here. We've spent the money, and the poverty level's the same, and it's just going downhill. We're not even getting a little bit of growth.
Any other questions? I'm sorry, Director Ricker.
That's okay. Would you share the study? It has been cited a number of times in this task force, this review, what you're citing about inflation, because I'm not clear, based on the calculations made to settle the lawsuit and deal with the inflation factor. I just appreciate the same point of reference to read.
Representative Williams.
Well, sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. We were provided by the KLRD. There was another one that I was provided by KLRD about a couple years ago that actually even showed a greater, because they took it back years further. In that one, we were at 118% of increase in state funding over a period of, with 48% inflation. But the one that we just received, I think it was last meeting, it actually showed inflation and it showed how much we were spending, and we have always exceeded inflation. And so that's the document that KLRD found. And then the other place that I'm looking is ks.gov.org, and that's where you're going to see all of our spending in totality, and you can see inflation marked in the same way. So those are two good places for you to start.
And I also have one from Georgetown that has done this for all of the states and have a website that you can, it's interactive, you can go in, and I have that one as well. So there are multiple sources that have produced that same information. Dr. Harwood.
And I don't want us to get us farther down a rabbit hole, but if we're looking at state spending that far back, we need to take into consideration where the 20 mils has been, because that far back, the 20 mils would have been local. So we just need to make sure we're accounting for that in there somewhere.
Oh, I thought you had your hand up, Representative. Any other comments, questions before we move on? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Heidi, for your time and for being here and presenting that. Appreciate it very much. Okay, next we will have Jennifer present on modeling for at-risk weighting. Jennifer?
Hello, everyone. Just for the record, my name is Jennifer Light. I'm the Senior Fiscal Analyst for KLRD, who works with the K-12 budget. So you have a plethora of models in front of you. We are going to be talking about the ones with the goldenrod sheet, which say at-risk weighting. We do have 4 after that that are pink, which are a combination that we'll discuss after that. So I just request that if you're looking at those, you wait until we have Matt come up. If we have time today, which it looks like we may, based on where we're at, but we'll see where we are with everybody's questions. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is we have changed the overview model for everybody for this round based on feedback. So there is a 8x11 goldenrod sheet in your packet as well, which has an overview of the models, which includes the current model and then the models that are in the packet for at-risk funding, which includes the total state foundation aid, general fund transfers to at-risk, total computed local option budget transfers to at-risk, and then supplemental state aid. So this is based on the feedback from last meeting, as well as a couple people who reached out after the meeting itself. We also have, and Matt's going to hand out, a packet which is an example sheet for each of these. So with the same district information that is a made-up district, you are, of course, welcome to look at any of the districts on any of the sheets and go look at them across the board, but this is just a step-by-step walkthrough of how you would get to this information using the district information at the top. So I believe this is something that members have asked for as well, and so we're trying to make sure that we provide things in different ways as well. So that's on the orchid piece of paper you just got. The overview is the 8x11 or 8.5x11 that kind of gives you just an overall. Why the overview may be considered important is because at-risk is the first one of the weightings that we have talked about where we are pulling money directly to a fund from both the general fund and then the local option budget section. And so we did want to make sure that was called out on a document for you where you could see how much money we're talking about that is being put into the at-risk fund from each of those sections. So as we've talked about at different ones, but we'll give you a reminder here because we are now further along in the afternoon. Each of these models have a different model number at the top that is hopefully to help everybody be able to reference which ones of these at-risk documents we're talking about. So you can say, I'm looking at the at-risk document, model 1.0, model 1.01, so we can all get to the same spot quicker together. The first model is removing the at-risk weighting, but maintaining the high-density at-risk weighting. And again, with all of these models, we have the first several pages are by USD district number, and then you can flip about halfway through the packets for each of these, and you will be able to see them with the changes in the total difference, with the most reduced at the top, moving down into those districts that would receive more funding based on each of these. I'd be happy to stand for questions on just removing the at-risk weighting, but generally we like to discuss the difference between that and rolling it into base. So I'm just going to, with your permission, Madam Vice Chair, I'm just going to roll into Model 1.01, which is at-risk funding rolled into base.
That sounds good, thank you.
Okay. So with this one, as with most of these models that we're going to be discussing in this first round, we are talking about just the at-risk weighting going away. The high density is still there. So that, in the models we're talking about today, the high density is still there. We do have some models where we look at both. We're going to talk about those tomorrow after we discuss high density. So I just wanted to make sure you know we do have some of those coming as well. So with Model 1.10, you can see in the upper corner, we talk about that green is the actual, with base being 5,378. Purple is the model, and with this rolling the at-risk funding into base, it moves base up to 6,275. And then the yellow sections on each of these documents is the changes between the actuals and the models. So when we talk about rolling at-risk funding into base, we're talking about a difference in state foundation aid of $4,500. So don't like to say very small, but in general, when we're talking about education, that's a very small difference. A total difference when you add in the computed LOB is a negative 16.2 million. My apologies for misspeaking there. And so I'd be happy to stand on questions. I know that sometimes it's nice to have a refresher before we get rolling into the different types. So outside of the two base ones that we are using for each of the models.
Any questions at this point? Senator Petty.
So, Jennifer, can you explain to me, so if I look at Model 1.0 and then Model 1.01, and there's column I in either one, and then actually it becomes column K, it changes. Okay, I'll just start with Model 1.0. So I'm taking a school district that I'm very familiar with, Turner School District. They're on the Model 1.0, they have a difference of over $7 million less. And then you go down to the model weighting, you go straight across, it's $7 million less. If I go to Model 1.01, and where it's at-risk rolled into the base, they are losing $3 million in column K, the model difference from the current. But in column CIP, they're losing 7 million. Can you explain that to me?
Sure thing. So when we're talking about the model weighting section, in these two documents, we're talking about completely removing at-risk. And so when you fully remove the at-risk weighting, that's the $7 million that you're looking at with Turner, Kansas City, USD 202. With the rolling the funding into base, we are increasing the base amount. And so even though there are fewer FTEs in total, because the dollar amount goes up, the difference for the state foundation aid would be less. So that's why it's the 3.1 million in the rolled into base, because in the model 1.0, there is no addition to base. It is just, we remove this. This is how much would be less in state foundation aid in column I. Whereas in model 1.1, because of the increase in base, there is still a overall decrease in state foundation aid for that specific district, but it is less due to the fact that there is additional money going into base. So if you think about it, the section where it says model weighting, that's where we're talking about the change specifically for the model, the weighting itself, what the at-risk weighting. And then when you look at the state foundation aid sections, columns E through I or columns E through K, you're talking about overall with state foundation aid due to whatever other changes we have had to put in place. And again, I was remiss in mentioning this earlier, but on page 7 of the documents, or the last page of every document, we do try to put in the model assumptions that we are dealing with. So you can see when base increases, if there were other areas that we had to change due to impacts on it as well. So you can see what assumptions were built into each of the models. But that kind of is the difference between the state foundation aid, it's looking at it holistically with everything that changed, versus the weighting, which is just this specific. So when you change the base dollar amount, you are going to change state foundation aid.
Thank you.
Any other questions at this point for Jennifer? Okay, seeing none, please proceed.
Okay, we're going to move to model 1.2. So 1.2, one of the ways that we were asked to look at this from the task force last time was looking at Title I percentages. And so what this model does is it basically takes the same dollar amount that we used for the weighting, the $506.7 million, and then it breaks it out as the same percentages as each USD got in their Title I dollar amounts for the previous fiscal year, because the federal fiscal year runs on a different time frame than the state does, and so using the previous federal year's Title I percentages made more sense. So when you do that, there are a couple of things that we do want to mention. This model was easy to run this year because we already had a dollar amount that we were using in 2025. So if you are wanting to use something like this where you use the Title I percentages moving forward, there would have to be some discussions about how exactly you're getting to the dollar amounts to be broken out in those percentages. That could go in a couple of different ways. You could do it the same as you do special education, where you come up with a dollar. You could do it the same ways, the transportation, or we do other ones where we have allotments basically and we back into the FTEs, but that is one of the extra steps you would have to consider when looking at Title I as this model is laid out currently. You could also look at it and say you want to increase the total dollar amount by CPIU. There are multiple different ways you could go, but that is something that is built into the way that this model was done, is it's using a dollar amount specific and then working backwards to get to what each district gets, as opposed to working from the school district forward as most weighted FTEs do. So when running this model, you can see that there is no difference in state foundation aid overall or in the weighting. And then there's 147,842 difference in local option budget. So I'm happy to talk through this one a little bit further or do a couple more models and then let you all process and come back to them.
Representative Estes has a question.
Thank you. Jenny, this is excellent. Can you please give me a quick refresher on, does school lunch play into Title I?
Oh, I looked this up last night. I don't believe so, and I'm getting a shake from Dr. Harwood, so I'm going to go with no. Title I does not have free lunch factoring into it.
Thank you both, and thanks for playing along with the pop quiz.
I wasn't prepared for the pop quiz today.
Any other questions before we move on? Anyone want any additional information or questions on this particular model? You can always come back. Okay, I think we're ready to move on.
Okay, the next several models, we are going to be talking about replacing the free lunch students with basically the state assessment results. And so that's models 1.03, 104, 105, 106 for certain. So we'll start with that. Model 1.03, basically what we're doing here is we took and replaced the free lunch qualifier with the highest for each school district for level 1. So each school district has a total number of students, or total percentage of students who get a level 1 on either the ELL or the ELA portion or the math portion. And so going to use my lovely example because I think that's probably the easiest way without confusing everybody. If you look on page 2 of the Okra sheet, it says model 1.3. So in District 1, in this example, it'd be students with a level 1 in ELA would be 20.5%, whereas students with a level 1 in math is 24.4%. We chose the higher of either one of these two for the way that this model runs. So for this specific district, it would be that they took 24.4% and then multiplied it against the total adjusted enrollment, and then multiplied that against the factor to get to the dollar, or to the FTE for at-risk funding portion. So basically, to make a long story short, instead of taking the free lunch, we have moved that to, in model 1.03, that's level 1, and then you multiply that by your adjusted enrollment to get to the place where you would be then multiplying it by the factor. In model 1.4, we took levels 1 and 2 and did the same thing. So the higher of the students, the higher number of percentage of students who were in levels 1 and 2. But the same basic formula walked through the same way. Then when we get to model 1.05, we adjust the factor to basically to hold harmless, basically. So looking at an effort of, we talked about why did the legislature choose 0.484 previously. Well, changing the factors at this point would bring you closer to the dollar amounts that would be what you would see currently. So that's how we did our adjustments here, was just to sort of hold harmless at the level of funding moving forward. And so that's what it is with models 1.05 and 1.06. It's still levels 1 or levels 1 and 2, but it's just adjusting the factors based on holding harmless. Was a lot of information that sounds really complicated as we all stare at documents. Happy to take a moment to pause to let you reflect and think on that and let that soak in before we move on to model 1.07.
Give it just a moment and we'll see if any questions arise. Representative Getz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On Model 1.05, and you did great. I think I understand where you're moving, but you just said Model 1.05 is kind of correct me if I'm wrong, is more of a hold harmless, trying to get, and I understand that that's statewide, but I look at Sedgwick County, model difference would be the 4 million. And then I go, and I'm on like that one that orders the district, kind of the second sheet in model, the second set in model 1.05. And like two pretty large districts are seeing a vast difference in a loss for Sedgwick, a loss for Wyandotte, loss for Shawnee, pretty large districts, but then also Johnson County, Olathe, Johnson County, Blue Valley are increasing 5 million and 3 million. Would you just clue me in as to how that happens and why that happens in this particular model?
So what I can tell you is that as we go through with these and we do the changes in the factors, the factor change does affect the number of weighted FTE overall. And so the number of weighted FTE is obviously how we get to the dollar amount from that. I'm not certain exactly why specifically those districts, but I think my colleague Matthew has an answer on that one, so.
Matthew.
Madam Chair, Representative, so the main difference that I think you're seeing here is that change from the factor being at risk based on the number of free lunch FTE to then becoming a factor that is based on the percentage of a district's enrollment that is achieving a 1 or a 1 and 2, depending on the model on the state assessment. So you are likely seeing the outsized impact of, for instance, 259 Wichita or 500 Kansas City having students who are free and reduced lunch who are achieving greater on the test. And so whereas in districts that are gaining, those are likely districts where you are having a smaller percentage who are free lunch, but who have a higher kind of comparative percentage that is achieving on those 1s and 2s. So I think it's highlighting that difference of, as we've discussed, that the free and reduced lunch is not necessarily an overlap for achieving a level 1 or a 2 on state assessments, is my guess is where you're seeing a lot of that discrepancy.
Thank you for that, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, I think we can move on. Jennifer, thank you.
Sure. Model 7 and Model 8 deal with, instead of using free lunch students, we took the USD poverty percentages from the US Census. And so this is, again, just looking at a different factor that you would choose to use for your calculations. Model 1.07 is just replacing the free lunch with USD poverty percentages. And then Model 1.08 is, again, the effort to statewide hold harmless and maintain the same dollar amounts. And so it does change the factors for the at-risk based on that. And so, as you can see, if you look at just the replacing the free lunch with the USD poverty percentages, we are talking about a difference of $367.9 million in state foundation aid and $122.2 million in local option budget funding, for basically a negative difference of $490 million if you do not change the factors at all, which is why we went ahead and ran one where it was changing the factors to bring it closer to hold harmless, in which case the total difference at that point is $90,258. And so these are based off of the census poverty, so this is operating off of a little bit further back poverty percentages because the US Census obviously publishes later. It takes longer to get those, and so I believe this is the US Census Small Area Income and Poverty Estimate for 2023 is what we're using in these models. So 23 for 25, so you're talking a 2-year difference in that poverty discussion.
Representative Estes.
Jennifer, how often do they update those numbers?
Every 2 years? Every year. I'm going to let Matthew answer that question for me instead of trying to guess what his.
Matthew.
Madam Chair, Representative, so they are updated annually. The census with the poverty threshold, which is what this is based off of, I believe tends to come out the fall of the subsequent year. So like this fall, they should release 2024's, whereas the free lunch is based off of the federal poverty guidelines, which is issued at the beginning of a year by HHS. So they're slightly different, but the ones from the census are usually about 9 to 10 months kind of behind, I think.
Thank you.
Other questions at this time? Okay, please continue.
Okay, the last two of the at-risk weightings that are just dealing with at-risk weightings deal with an average. This is basically taking two factors. We included the free lunch qualifier and then did the highest for either level 1 or levels 1 and 2 on the state assessments. And so basically this is continuing to keep in the free lunch students discussion, and then you would average that with the highest of your levels for state assessments for levels 1 or level 1 and 2 to get to your factor that you would then come in with. And so this is basically saying if you wanted to combine two different factors, this would be a way to do it. We ran them off of free lunch qualifier as that was one that is already in statute, as well as if we added in the highest level. So if it's highest for level 1, we're looking at a model difference of, for the state foundation aid of 47.8 million, and then a model difference from LOB funding of 15.8 million. Whereas if you look at levels 1 and 2, you have an increase of 156 million for state foundation aid, and then an increase of 51.9 million in local option budget. So the difference between level 1 and 2 versus level 1 is pretty different. With that, Madam Chair, those are the base models that we have run for you. I'd be happy to stand for questions on any of them, or we can move on to the next section of models if you would like to hear about that first.
Let's see if there are any questions about these at this point. Again, I think it's going to be absorption time and then maybe come back with questions tomorrow. So we will move on.
Yeah, I do want to make one more comment, Madam Chair. I know that with the high and low enrollment, the question was, is what are other states doing? And so when we talk about the at-risk weighting, the different options you have here are basically what other states are doing. And so we cover the majority of what other states are doing with the at-risk funding for options instead of free lunch within these. Happy to continue to look at other things if people come up with them, but just so everybody has working knowledge of that. And with that, I will turn it over to Matthew.
Good afternoon again, Madam Chair, members of the task force. I will let Jenny and Tamara kind of pass out yet another ORCID sheet because it's kind of the same, but also kind of different. So this is going to be the models that are behind the pink sheet in there. This is once again looking at risk, but it is also adding in a new weighting that is currently dubbed the success weighting, just in an attempt to be kind of blunt. So, or I guess I should say more unimaginative on my part with it. So, kind of diving in, you'll have I will note on your pink overview model for it, there is a slight typo on 1.03. The total state foundation aid should read should basically be $4.4 billion, not the 4.2. I'm working on getting it corrected digitally, but just for your kind of use on that one. So, I guess diving into it, so these will be kind of similar in the sense of they are utilizing, as Jennifer just discussed the level 1 or the level 1 and 2 as the qualifiers and the change for at risk. The difference with this is introducing an additional weighting that is based off of levels 3 and 4. And the impetus behind this was, as noted during the LPA, when Heidi was discussing the audits, that proficiency weightings can potentially have that kind of negative incentive of you losing money for doing what you should be doing, or for students kind of growing out of it or succeeding. And so this attempts to kind of create a weighting that is saying if at risk is based on your student population that is in these levels of the state assessment, either 1 or 1 and 2, then here is also money that is based upon your students moving into 3 and 4. The main element that you will see on the difference is that this success weighting, as it's dubbed in these models, is about half of the weighting factor that at risk is. The difference being, assuming all other current law is the same, at risk, as what Tamara discussed earlier, is spent only on certain things legally allowable for at risk. This success weighting, since it is brand new, would not be. And so it would be districts, as a student moved from level 1 or 1 and 2, depending on the model, and moved into 3 or 4, the district would be giving up money that is kind of regulated in how they spend it within that at risk to be getting money that is, they have more agency to utilize, but to also still support the fact that they have moved a student from kind of one weighting into another. And so that's what all of these do. Essentially, they are all just trying to help show different potentials for you. So 1.02 is where the at-risk is just level 1. And then the success weighting is again 3 and 4, and it is using the current weighting factor. So at-risk would be 0.8 or 0.484, and success would be 242. And so looking at that, then the difference for state foundation aid is it is a total, state total positive of $105 million of additional state funding. When you include local option budget, that's $140 million of additional funding. 103 and 104 are doing the same thing, except they are keeping at risk. They have adjusted the factor so that it is at the current funding limit or funding level of $506 million statewide, and so kind of adjusting the factor for at risk accordingly to fit that final dollar total, and then the success weighting being half of that, and then the final 1.304 with 05 and 06 being models to show you what it could look like if you kept both weightings, so at risk and this new success weighting, if both of those together equaled that $506 million. So again, a lot of them are just different ways of trying to come up with factor elements so that you can kind of see some different potentials. But the crux of it is providing something that a district would get as it, based on its students in 3 and 4, along with it having that at risk. So with that, I would be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you, Matthew. Very interesting concept here. So are there questions at this point? Director Rooker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In looking at, Jennifer mentioned that these are models from other states. The idea is coming from other states. I'm curious how what controls for ensuring if fund, and I think the success factor maybe is a piece of addressing this, but in the set that Jennifer presented, where it is all about how many students you have in level 1 or level 1 and 2, then are we not incentivizing doing nothing for those students and leaving the funding alone as a consequence? So I'm wondering what controls might be in place in states that use those models where the money is tied to not moving students out of those levels.
So, Madam Chair, Director, I would have to look further into controls for that. That's part of kind of the idea with having this that's 3 to 4 is that it is working that incentive of saying, you know, as you can move students rather than like, yes, you would receive less per student, but that's where you then get the tie of it being money the district would have more discretion over, potentially, and that they would be getting less. And so I think ideally, at least under this model, the framework would be the argument that besides districts wanting students to succeed, that there would be the incentive of saying, these are students succeeding, they might need fewer supports around them, but also we are getting money we have more discretion over where you don't have to worry about all of the elements built around the success. They can just go and do it for kind of the needs that they have in that district. But again, we can look further in what other states might be using as controls who utilize assessments and things like that. I just don't have it with me right now.
Representative Estes.
Thank you. In a way, if you think about it right now, the status quo is an incentive not to improve because you lose funding. So this makes improving less painful.
The set with the success
Yes,
factor. Yeah,
yes.
I looked at the other set and I thought, well, you know, in a world where we want districts to take accountability and do the right things for their students, when you're tying to the funding to the lower performance on the assessments, that's the weighting factor. That, to me, is not logical. So I appreciate the chance to dig into this model, to think about this approach.
Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I get heartburn when we rely so heavily on one data point like this. I kind of left the world of teaching after No Child Left Behind because of our large emphasis on test scores, right? So I get a little heartburn when we look at that, but I'm trying to reverse engineer a little bit, and I may have missed it, but is there a place on these charts that shows how many students, for example, Blue Valley has in level 1 state assessment, or, you know, a 1 or a 2? Or is that a chart that we could get just overall?
Madam Chair, Representative, we have all of the data. It is not listed on here just for the sake of size, but we could absolutely provide you something that shows the percentages. And again, these are the percentages for all students at all grade levels for each district. So obviously not every student, since not every grade level takes it, not every student in the district would, but yeah, we can get you the data.
I would like that. I just think that I appreciate the spirit of this because I do think it's important that we incentivize progress. But, you know, relying on 1 or 2 snapshots for such an impactful piece of funding, it makes me nervous.
Right, yes, Dr. Kemp.
I'm just curious on states that implement this type of model, do they have a testing opt-out policy like we do here in Kansas?
Madam Chair, Superintendent, I would have to look further. I'm not sure.
Dr. Harwood.
Federal law requires the ability to opt out for state assessment. So yes, they do.
Anything else at this point? Yes, Dr. Harwood.
I mean, that does bring up an interesting situation of a non-tested student, just so they're not in any level. And so they wouldn't be in there. And I think that can be taken into account of, but I mean, it's just going to be a fact because even state and federal law, state in Kansas and federal anyway, allows parents to opt their students out of state assessment. So, but it would lower the number theoretically in every category.
Yes, Dr. Kemp.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the other piece of that is the increase of opt-outs we're seeing out in the schools. So as we move and we're getting more and more opt-outs, this to me almost becomes dysfunctional because those kids are counted nowhere.
So if I may, Dr. Harwood, does KSDE have statistics on the number of students who opt out statewide? And then can we see the trend in that, to Dr. Kemp's point, that that's an increasing option that parents are exercising?
Yes, we can look at trend. I mean, so a student is recorded as testing or not testing, or they can be recorded as not required to test based on when they've moved into a district. If they get there late enough, then they don't test at all. But yeah, we have that for every student that was enrolled during the testing window. So we can look at trends.
Okay, anything else? I think we're going to find there's no perfect model. Maybe we can invent one that other states will say. So, Matthew, please continue.
Madam Chair, that was kind of the list I had. Again, I will note there is the ORCID sheet passed out that kind of walks through the different, each one specifically, if you're wanting to kind of see the math for it more. But yeah, that was all I had, was just going over these different ones.
Okay. Thank you, Matthew. So, committee. We are way ahead of schedule, which I think is a good thing. Rarely happens in here. We normally have run out of time and don't have enough time to do what we need to do. However, what I would like to say is, I would encourage you to take this opportunity. We have a lot of time built into tomorrow's agenda for discussion, and I have a feeling it's just because we haven't had a time to absorb a lot of things related to the information that was provided today. So I would say, take this time, if you have time this evening, go over it, come back with any questions. We will circle back. And just to let you know, for tomorrow, we do have lunch on your own, so make plans for that. And we will then have a lot of discussion on at-risk weighting. We will have another presentation from Dr. Harwood. Thank you for that. And before we adjourn for the day, Senator Petty.
Madam Chair, I just wanted to bring up something, because I got because I serve on post-audit, I got the email from post-audit about the request for a bilingual post-audit, and it said that it was approved by this committee, but I don't recall, I knew we had a discussion, but I don't recall we ever had any kind of vote. And to me, that seems to put a different weight on, and I reached out to a couple of other people because I wasn't sure if I just somehow blanked out on the vote. But, so could we discuss that, whether we actually had a vote on the bilingual post-audit discussion or request?
Certainly. Thank you for bringing that up to clarify. as an outcome of our discussion on bilingual funding and wanting to kind of see an updated audit from the previous one, I did make that request. I did not make that request as a committee request. So when it was written up to go to LPA, I do not know how that was framed, but that was a request that I made. So I can clarify that for LPA if need be, or if we want to submit that as a committee request, I'm great with that. If not, I will make sure that the committee knows that that was a request that I made, not necessarily representative of the entire committee. So I apologize for that. I didn't intend my request to be framed that way, so.
I think
Yes,
it's,
Senator Petty.
I think it's important that be corrected, because it does, and this committee would not know because it only went out to those that serve on post-audit. But it does put it at a different level, I believe, when it says it's coming from, as a request from this committee, because now post-audit is going to be taking it up at their July 21st meeting. And then might be taken up as it came as a request from the chair, but I think it's needs to be amended.
I am happy to make that formal clarification for the committee so they know that that was my request, not representative of this task force, if that alleviates that concern. Yes, Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of things. Number one, we could take a vote right now. I could make a motion and we could vote on it. Number two, we've actually filled our audits, as you know, at this point. So it'd be if we scooted something or shortened something, or if it was made into a short audit. So those would be the options. I think it's presented as a proposal, but it might not even be brought up until next year. But Madam Chair, if you'd like me to make a motion, I'd be happy to do so to make it more legitimate.
I will leave that up to your, I would entertain that. It is in order if you want to make that. If not, I'm happy to make that clarification.
Okay, so just for our committee, since I am going to make a motion, I guess we need to know who can vote on this. Maybe we first need to raise our hands of who's a voting member.
So the non-voting members, I believe, are Dr. Harwood, Mr. Moore, Director Rooker, and, yeah, Director Rooker, and Adam Prophet are the 4 non-voting members. Does that clarify that? Correct? Yes, Senator Petty.
Well, I think before we take a vote, I think it would be important for the committee to know what was put out in the post-audit and what were the requests that were listed there, because that currently no one on this committee except for Representative Williams and myself have that information.
Okay. Okay, we can have the revisor, I was looking for that as Senator Petty, and good point, so that everyone is clear on the scope of the audit that was requested. And I believe that Revisor Lawrence has that. Just emailed is fine, so. Do we have a motion? No.
Well, what I was going to say is we could pause, we could table the motion and bring it back tomorrow, and then that gives everybody an opportunity to take a look at it.
Okay, so we will table it. We will have the actual request emailed to the task force so you can look at that, have some time to digest it, and we will come back and take this up at our meeting tomorrow. Yes, Representative McDonald.
As far as process goes, if it were approved by this committee, does that bring it up in the legislative post-audit list? I'm seeing a yes and I'm seeing a no.
I'm not on that committee, so we will let Revisor Lawrence answer that.
All audit proposals that are presented to the post-audit committee then have to be acted on by the committee. So this would just be a presentation to that committee, and then the post-audit committee would get to decide what to do with it.
Okay, so it might be a little subjective as to whether or not it rises to importance in the committee because those committee members aren't here. So that answers my question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's dependent on the mindset of each committee member. I don't know, so. So either way, we will settle this. Either I will make the clarification or we'll vote on it as a committee to make sure that that's clear to the post-audit committee. Does that suffice for everyone? Does that work for tomorrow? Okay, very good. Thank you for bringing that up, Senator Petty. Is there any other business we need to take care of before we adjourn? Oh, Matthew.
Madam Chair, I did, per the request earlier about some kind of explanation examples for those density models. I have that, so I just want to let everyone know I was going to go ahead and pass them out, so don't immediately rush for the door, unless you don't want them, in which case, by all means, so.
Thank you. As always, staff is so quick and responsive to the request, so appreciate that and get that from Matthew. Committee, we will start at 9 a.m. in the morning. Again, thank you to those who substituted in. We'll see you